Greetings, citizens. Hey you beautiful creepy human being you, and welcome to today's true crime video. I am so happy that you are here. I am so happy that somehow in all of this that we're forced to deal with on the day today you and I were able to find each other on this crazy little planet that we call home. My name is Brittany or Bratterstein, whichever you prefer, and today we are having a true crime marathon. But before we get started, if you have not yet had the pleasure, please make sure to join the Brat Pack by subscribing and ringing the bell. I put out a new video every single week, sometimes 2 a week like this week, and I would love to hang out with you. Yes, you specifically you, but I can only do that if you join the Brat Pack and become one of us. Alright, so today's video is one that I've uploaded from time to time, and it is, again, a true crime marathon. I first started putting these up after I saw Good Mythical Morning do it because I'm the type of person who needs to have some sort of background noise in my life. I cannot live with silence. So what I like to do is put on a comfort YouTuber's longest video they have and just have it playing throughout the day as I do dishes, as I vacuum, as I read. I need noise. I can't have nothing. It doesn't work for me. And I know for some people I am your comfort YouTuber. Thank you. You are everything, and every view and every interaction means the world to me. So that's why I started making these videos, is for people like me who can't deal with silence. So if you need a long video to put on in the background of your day, to put on for your dog while you leave to go to the store or to work, to put on to fall asleep to, this is for you, so keep watching. My name is Brittany or Bratterstein, whichever you prefer, and today we're going to be discussing the absolutely tragic murder of Elle King. This video is on a case that was recommended to me by a member of the Brat Pack named Annabelle Lee. Hi, Annabelle Lee. Thank you, Annabelle Lee. And I want to know if that's your real name or if that's an Edgar Allan Poe reference, because I did just recently rewatch The Following, so it's very fresh in my mind. But anyways, this case, it's very upsetting. It's pretty maddening, to be honest. And it's a case I've never heard of, and I'm actually surprised that I've never heard of it because this case took place in Oxnard, which really isn't far from where I live, but somehow I never heard about it. And in looking into this case, it was very upsetting. It was very frustrating. And I think that's partially because I watched a documentary on this case called Valentine's Road. And a lot of people involved in this documentary, from teachers to jurors, were really rude in this documentary, really victim blamey, and, you know, a little bit homophobic is the vibe that I got. And it just made me feel just awful. And I've mentioned this before. These are the types of cases that really, really get under my skin and really, really bother me. It's one of the most frustrating cases I've looked into because this was initially treated as a hate crime, and those types of cases really just hit me a little bit different. But I will never stop covering them, and I will never stop being wary of their upload date, because when I tell you, anytime I do a case on a hate crime, I get far more comments that are negative than in any other type of video. I swear, it's people who have never commented on a video in the past feel compelled to say something when it comes to a case like this. And oftentimes they're even people who are trying to cover up the hateful thing they're going to say by being like, I don't mean to be mean, but, and I just get very exhausted with the buts in cases like this. So, Elle is how I'm going to be referring to our victim in this story. And Elle was born Lawrence and actually went by Larry up until like the week that they were killed. The week that they were killed, they mentioned wanting to start being called Letitia, but it was very new. Elle was just getting to a place of comfortability and acceptance of who they were, and they had changed their names several times and tried different names out and different identities out for a while prior to being killed. So I'm going to call them Elle out of respect. And Elle was murdered at the age of 15 in a classroom full of other like 15-year-old kids. They were murdered at school in front of an entire classroom of people. It is absolutely horrifying. So today I'm going to tell you that entire story. I read all the things so that you do not have to. And at the end of this video, I want you to answer the question of the day. I'm going to give it to you now so you can have it kicking around in your head as we go through the details of this case. But obviously I want you to answer it when you have some information to go on. But the question of the day is this. Do you believe that this case should have been dealt with as a hate crime? And do you believe that the sentencing for the person responsible for killing Elle was sufficient? Let me know all your thoughts in the comments below after we go through the details of this case. And now, with all of that said, come gather around and let me tell you the story of the tragic murder of Elle King. Our story begins at Green Junior High School, and this was in Oxnard, California. It's February 12th, 2008, and a classroom of 8th graders is moving from one room into the computer lab so that they can work on writing their papers. They were writing papers on various topics related to tolerance in relation to World War II. So the group of students is walking over, and at the head of the class is Elle and their teacher. And Elle and their teacher were super duper close. Elle had actually brought their teacher a Dixie cup full of flowers because they were just like the sweetest kid. So all 28 students, along with their teacher, file into this classroom, and Elle takes a seat right in the middle of the room at a computer because it's a computer lab and starts working on their paper. The topic that they've chosen is protest songs of the 1960s, and they're sitting there doing their work, and a boy named Brandon, who was 14 years old, took a seat directly behind Elle. Like, not at a computer, by the way. He was sitting in a chair, like, up against the wall. Brandon was seemingly fuming. He seemed to be very angry, very pissed off, and was frequently looking over to Elle, but not working. And the teacher asked, like, why aren't you working, kind of thing. And Brandon said that he was done with his paper, which was a paper on Adolf Hitler. So then he took out a book and just kind of pretended to read. The teacher of the classroom said that everybody was just working. There was the sounds of, keyboards typing, and an 8th grade class doing classwork, normal sounds. When all of a sudden she heard a loud pop. And kids who had been in the class that day said that it kind of just sounded like a balloon had popped. So the teacher kind of looked around and she saw that Brandon was just standing up, just standing in the center of the room. And she kind of looked at him, not understanding what had happened yet. She looked at him, he looked at her, and she said, like, what are you doing? But he didn't answer. And then he raised the gun and he fired a second shot. And it's at this moment she realized what was going on, and Elle fell to the floor. What had happened here is that at approximately 8:15 in the morning, dude, Brandon had reached into the front pocket of his sweatshirt and he pulled out a gun. Brandon, who was 14 years old, had brought a .22 caliber revolver to school. He had gotten this from one of his family members. I don't think they gave it to him. Like, he took it, but he had access to guns in his household. He wrapped it in a towel and he shoved it in his backpack. And then at some point, he got it out of his backpack, he put it in his front pocket, and then just waited till he felt like the time was right. And then he got up, walked up to Elle, and shot them twice in the back of the head before the gun jammed. And so, since they couldn't shoot anymore, he threw the gun on the floor, and he fled. He didn't get very far, though. He was picked up by police just like 10 minutes later and a couple of blocks away. But now everyone was left to ask the question, why did a 14-year-old just assassinate one of his classmates in front of a classroom full of people? Now, to answer that question, let's talk about who Elle and Brandon were. Elle Phobes King was born on January 13th, 1993 in Ventura, California, and they were born into chaos right from the beginning. Elle was born to a very young mother. She was only 15 years old when she gave birth, and as soon as she did give birth, Elle's father dipped. No involvement at all. So she was left to do the hardest job in the world completely by herself. And she was already struggling. Like, she had a crack cocaine addiction at just 15 years old. And now she had this little baby that she had to care for and provide for all by herself. Now, in order to do this, in order for Elle's mother to be able to afford to provide for her and her new baby, she went into sex work so that she would have some money coming in, not only for her family, but also to support her drug habit, because she did have a problem there as well. And then a hard situation got even worse when she became pregnant again, and then she gave birth to another baby. This was a little boy, Elle's little brother, who she named Rocky. And it was just a totally unideal situation. So when Elle was just 2 years old, Elle and their little brother Rocky, who was a newborn at the time, ended up actually being taken away from their mother, and they were adopted into a new family by a new couple, and this was Gregory and Dawn King. Now, I don't want to sugarcoat Elle's early childhood experience, because it is said that their birth mother was not super great. There were allegations of neglect and abuse, and when Gregory and Dawn adopted the two, they were told that the kids had been, like, not being fed properly. They were malnourished. So it was just a rough start right from the very beginning. And we don't have much more information than that, because Elle's biological mother actually died shortly before Elle was murdered, so she's not here to answer for herself. So that's as much as we really know. So now Elle is in this new home, has this new life, but it isn't an easy experience here either. Elle had long-standing issues stemming from an unstable home life and ended up at a young age being diagnosed with reactive attachment disorder, which is a condition where a child fails to develop relationships with his or her caregivers. They also had issues in school, having to repeat the first grade, and this was likely due in part to the fact that they were struggling with ADHD, though they did end up getting on medication to help with this. The issues were said to persist into the older ages for Elle as well. For example, Greg, Elle's adopted father, said that they had behavioral issues right up until they were killed. For example, Greg said that they could not get Elle to clean their room, and that if they would try to just send them to their room, be like, you have to go in there and you can't come out till you do it, Elle would just stab holes into the wall with a screwdriver. They also said that they couldn't take Elle to the grocery store because there was no chance that Elle would go into a store without shoplifting. So they just refused to take them. They were like, this is too much of a hassle. I'm not even going to do it. But we will find out, which we're going to get into a little bit more later, that there may have been reason for Elle to have behavioral problems with the home they were in, even after being adopted. But we will get into that just a little bit later. Elle was said to be an incredibly sweet, gentle, and caring child. They loved to draw. They loved to paint. They loved to crochet. For example, Elle and their mother had crocheted a bunch of scarves, hundreds of scarves, and these scarves were sent overseas to soldiers in Afghanistan. And when Elle was in 7th grade for Christmas, they had crocheted their teacher this little a blanket, and then, I don't know why I forgot the word blanket, but a little blanket, and then they had also crocheted a little mouse, and this was so that they could give their teacher a little mouse to give to the teacher's cat as a gift. And the teacher just remembers being like, what 7th grader crochets? That is just adorable. The little mouse thing destroyed me. They were headstrong, confident, sweet, and had an amazing singing voice. Many people mentioned this, saying that they were gifted, with friends saying that they should try out for American Idol. Elle had even spent a ton of time practicing singing the Star-Spangled Banner because they wanted to sing the anthem at their little brother's baseball games. They loved nature and had a special connection with animals. Elle's adopted father, Greg, even said that there was this stray dog named Jasmine in the neighborhood, and this dog wouldn't go near anybody. The dog was like, absolutely not. But this dog would play fetch with Elle. Elle was just a sweet kid who wanted to grow up to be an ichthyologist because they were told when they were little that bugs were icky. And when they were younger, they went to was it a birthday trip? I think it was, to the Smithsonian Institute. And they got to see all kinds of bugs, and they were even pictured holding bugs. This was something that they were very, very interested in and something they wanted to do when they were older. And I guess at one point when they were younger, their mom had found a big old nasty potato bug in the house. And their mother knew that Elle is the person they should call to take care of this bug, because not only would they happily get the bug out of the house, but they would make sure to tell her the correct name for a potato bug, which I don't know what the name is, but I'm going to keep calling it a potato bug. Even though, really, if you've ever looked at a photo of this, a potato bug is a very nice thing to refer to this literal hellspawn on Earth. They were also a gardener and would plant passion fruit vines in their family's backyard because they knew that these particular plants attracted butterflies, and butterflies were Elle's favorite insect. Now, though that sounds kind of pure with the passion fruit vines and the crocheting with their mom and all of that, there were some issues with the home life, because Elle and their brother had been with the Kings for a long time, almost a decade, or maybe even over a decade, around the 10-year mark. But then in November of 2007, Elle actually ended up being removed from the Kings' home after allegations of Gregory King being physically abusive to Elle came out. Now, Gregory completely denies this, but it's a little bit sticky because it says that Elle was removed due to this abuse, the abuse claims, but also due to Elle, stealing from them. But it was said that what was being stolen was food, from their own refrigerator. So it's a little bit sticky. It's a little bit icky. And in the end, all that really matters here is that Elle was removed from that home and went to stay at a place called Casa Pacifica, which is a locally run shelter for kids that have been neglected or abused. Now, as I said, Gregory King denies any abuse, and I don't know, I wasn't there, but what I can say is that in the documentary I watched, one of Elle's friends said that Elle would always wear these long sleeves, and on the one occasion that they did not, this friend saw that Elle was covered in bruises, and that at the time that Elle was killed, they had a different legal guardian, and this was a woman named Tracy, and in the documentary, Tracy said that there were like more than 20 allegations of abuse made against Elle's adopted parents at the time. So do with that information what you will. Elle's friends say that Elle very rarely, if ever, talked about their family. And whenever other people would talk about their families, Elle would sort of put their head down and just look sad and like they were missing out on something. They said that Elle said that they had felt like they missed out on something and that they didn't really have a family, but that they had found support and community while staying in Casa Pacifica. It was while staying in this group home that Elle seemed to get the support and confidence to be who they really were and to start expressing themselves as such. I guess they had already started this, like taking the steps in this direction from a young age. Elle had come out as being gay at just like the age of 10, like in 3rd grade. And it was very difficult for them because kids are mean. Kids can really be dicks, especially if you are different. And Elle at a young age was. It was while staying at Casa Pacifica that Elle sort of started to explore their gender identity. They started wearing clothing that is more traditionally like women's clothing and accessories, things like that, you know, more traditionally women's clothes, heels, makeup, things like that. And it was while they were there that Tracy, Elle's legal guardian at the time, first saw Elle try on makeup. And I guess Elle put on this like bright purple eyeshadow and then went to Tracy and was like, how do I look? And Tracy was kind of like, well, to be honest, you kind of look like a clown. And as an older woman who has put makeup on for many, many years, I feel like I can say this to you. And then I guess she went out and she bought Elle a bunch of new makeup and different things and showed them how to apply it in a way that would accentuate their beauty. And it really made them feel happy and pretty to do this. So Elle is living in this group home and had been living there for 3 months prior to them being killed. And they were still in school, even though it was like a long bus ride in from the group home. They were still going to Green Junior High School. And this is where our story began today, where the murder ends up taking place. And at this time, they are in 8th grade. At 15 years old, Elle was like a small child, standing at only 5'1", but made a huge impression. And at this time, they were still getting a large amount of bullying, especially from the boys in school. And this is because not only had Elle already come out as being gay previously, now they were coming to school and they were wearing traditionally female accessories along with their school uniform. It's sad too, because Elle was getting all of this shit from their peers, which is disappointing, but to be expected because kids can be dicks. But honestly, Elle's teachers were low-key kind of giving them a hard time too. Not all of them, obviously, but some of the teachers were saying that Elle's clothing preferences were, quote, distracting and therefore a violation of the school dress code. But they couldn't really do anything about it because the California anti-discrimination law prevents discrimination based on gender, including gender expression. Apparently, the very first day that Elle started to wear these new accessories, they had gone to school and they tried to go into a classroom. Like, they're trying to just go in and get their education. And the teacher who was there at the time was a substitute teacher, would not let Elle into the classroom wearing what they were wearing. They sent them instead to the principal's office, and the principal called the school district and like gave the whole situation. They're like, this is what's going on. And the school district told them, like, you can't do anything about it. If girls are allowed to wear this, Elle is allowed to wear this too. The school even ended up issuing a formal notice that was sent out to all teachers, and this was sent out on January 29th, 2008, which was about 2 weeks before the murder. And the note said in part, quote, "We have a student on campus who has chosen to express his sexuality by wearing makeup. It is his right to do so. Some kids are finding it amusing, others are bothered by it. As long as it does not cause classroom disruptions, he is within his rights. We are asking that you talk to your students about being civil and non-judgmental. They don't have to like it, but they need to give him his space. We are also asking you to watch for possible problems. If you wish to talk further about it, please see me or Joy Epstein." The person who wrote this was one of the assistant principals named Sue Parsons, and Joy, who was referenced in it, was another assistant principal. I guess they had like hella assistant principals at the school, which I did not know was a thing, but now I know is a thing. Now, apparently this was upsetting for Elle's adopted mother, Dawn. She had an issue with like this notice going out and actually had an issue with the way Elle was dressing. And just 4 days prior to Elle's murder, she had reached out to the school asking them to try to get Elle to like tone it down. And she said of this quote, "I knew gut instinct that something serious was going to happen. They should have contained his behavior." But they didn't. They didn't try to contain Elle at all. They just let them be free to be themselves. And they were happy and they were sassy and they were bubbly and they had the type of character that was just fun to be around. They were always making you laugh and making you smile. And I saw one thing from one friend that said that like when Elle first started wearing the accessories, they were wearing this pair of like heeled boots, and one of Elle's friends went up to them and was like, "Oh my god, I love your boots, they're so cute." And I was like, "Oh my god, I know, aren't they so cute? If you want like nice boots, you got to get the pricey ones. These ones were $30. And Elle switched their look often. Sometimes they'd paint their nails pink. Sometimes they'd wear foundation and glitter, with one of their friends saying that Elle did better makeup than they did. And sometimes they would just do their hair up like Prince. Around this time, Elle also started spending time with almost exclusively girls at school. Like, this was their friends, was just girls. And they started sort of toying with what they wanted their name to be, kind of changing their names. They went from things like LaTanya and LaToya, finally landing on Letitia, but that was just like the day they were killed. And Elle said that Letitia was their alter ego, a strong, unstoppable, sassy black woman. Now, because of all this, Elle, who had already, been no stranger to bullying because of being who they were, was really starting to get a ton of backlash and harassment, particularly from the boys in school. They'd call Elle names, they'd throw wet paper towels at them in the bathroom, and they would just do everything they could to be little shitheads, quite frankly. And Elle decided that the best way that they could get back at these boys for giving them such a hard time was to openly flirt with them. Openly flirt with the boys that were giving them a hard time. So they would walk up to them in the locker room, tell them that they looked good. They would go and try to sit next to them at lunch. They would just kind of walk by with a little bit of sass. They'd sissy that walk, and they'd be like, "You know you want me." Anything they could to kind of give them back what they were giving to them. Give them back what they were giving to them. Yeah. And one of these boys that Elle had been having a particularly hard time with, one who Elle had had several tense altercations with, was a 14-year-old boy named Brandon McInerney. Brandon David McInerney was born on January 24th, 1994 in Ventura, California, just like Elle. And like Elle, he came up in a rough household. It was a household plagued with drug addiction by his mother, Kendra, and domestic violence at the hands of his father, William. So Brandon's parents' relationship happened super quickly. Basically what had happened is that Brandon's father, William, was a truck driver, and he was doing his job, driving trucks, like truck drivers do. And he ended up in Arkansas. When he was in Arkansas, he went to a grocery store, and this is where Kendra worked. And I guess he went up to her, and he's like, "Hey, would you like to go to California with me?" And she was like, "Absolutely, I do." So the next day, I don't think they had met before this, the next day, William comes, picks up Kendra, and the two drive to California together. They just drive to California together. They get there. They start dating. Things go well. So shortly after that, Kendra brings her two boys down there, two sons, to live with them as well. Then they, are together. She ends up getting pregnant. The two, which is Brandon. She was pregnant with Brandon. The two end up going to Vegas to go through like a drive-through Vegas wedding. Bing, bang, boom. Their relationship has happened. The baby has been made. The marriage is official, and at first, it was super happy. Kendra and her boys loved this new man in their lives, and things seemed like it was going to go very well. But of course, things changed once the abuse started. In 1993, so this was the year before Brandon was born, Kendra ended up calling the cops to report that her husband had shot her in the arm with a gun. Basically, he shot her, and it shattered her elbow and went through the wall. It went through a water heater, and it almost hit one of her sons. And this was a .45 caliber hollow point bullet. So that's already real bad, but that's not even all of it. In another instance, Kendra said that William had choked her to the point of unconsciousness after she had accused him of stealing her children's ADHD medication. And because of this, William did actually end up getting arrested for attacking his wife. And he pleaded no contest and served 10 days in jail and 36 months probation on a charge of domestic violence. The abuse, as I'm sure you can imagine, was not isolated to just Kendra. He was also abusive to the boys. So, for example, Brandon, who we're talking about today, Brandon didn't drink. Apparently, across the board, his family says that Brandon was like an angel. He was the kid that didn't get in trouble. He was the kid that didn't do drugs. He was very different from his brothers who got into lots of trouble. They describe Brandon as just being like a kid. He still likes to play with action figures, and he still liked to play with Pokemon cards. And he was just like a little kid. And again, he didn't drink. That was until he had his first drink. Now, Brandon had his first drink on the 4th of July, and it was one beer. He had one beer with his girlfriend. And when his father found out about this, he punched Brandon straight in the face and broke his nose. So a dick. We can say confidently that this guy was an asshole, but it seems like perhaps he wasn't the only one who was, a bit of the problem when it came to Brandon's upbringing, because it was said that his mother was also physically abusive. But then again, this particular story is coming from William, so who knows how truthful he's being. But he told the court that the domestic violence was mutual, and he said that Kendra had actually tried to run her car into his while Brandon was in the car. He also said that Kendra's home was the neighborhood drug house where people were always in and out and passed out in the front room. And he said that Kendra was abusive to Brandon and would like backhand him or scratch him. So needless to say, the two separated. William and Kendra separated. And in the beginning, the kids, this was Brandon and his two brothers, ended up going and being with Kendra. But over a period of 6 years? Or was it 6 months? Because that's a big difference. I think it was 6 months. Over a period of 6 months, William called CPS and reported Kendra as being an unfit mother 5 times. So like almost once a month. And this resulted in the kids actually being taken away from her. Well, at least Brandon being taken away from her. And this was in 2004. Brandon, I think, would have been about like 10 years old at this point, if I remember correctly, if I did that math correctly in my head. And Kendra ended up going into a rehab center. And William ended up getting custody of Brandon because the other 2 boys were old enough at this point that they didn't need to go with their father. So now Brandon is alone with his father, and according to his mother, this was a bad situation because William would abuse Brandon, and William would take Brandon on like drug runs and put him in situations he didn't want to be in. And Brandon did not want to be there, according to his mother, and I guess she's getting this information from him. And I guess whenever she would come to visit him, he would like beg her to take him with her when she would leave. He would be like, please just get a house so the 2 of us can be together again. I don't want to be here. But she was still in the rehab program at this time, so she could not do that. So she would have to leave him there. And she said that it was so bad that Brandon would like go outside in the yard and beat on a tree until his knuckles were bloody because he did not want to be there. So it was just a bad situation overall for him as well. So now let's go back to Brandon and Elle, 2 kids who honestly seem to have more in common than they would ever know when it came to their upbringing, and that's fucking sad, really. So Brandon and Elle, they are not getting along. Brandon's giving Elle a hard time for being themselves, wearing women's clothes, and Elle is not laying down and taking it, giving it right back. I guess it got very bad in the weeks leading up to the murder. And Elle even went up to Brandon while he was on the basketball court with a bunch of dudes and asked if Brandon would be their Valentine because this was in February when they did this, and the season of love was upon them. And what's really sad about this is that Elle's friends said that this wasn't just to be a dick to Brandon. It wasn't meant to be malicious. It was a joke, but also partially because Elle actually thought that Brandon was really cute. And that note breaks my heart. Elle called out, "I love you, baby," to Brandon while they were in the hallway. And I guess that same day, Elle, who was wearing their high-heeled boots that way, decided they were going to do a little strut. They were going to sissy that walk right by Brandon and a group of Brandon's friends. And I guess when Elle did this, all of Brandon's friends started to give him a hard time for Elle, flirting with them and, putting on a show for him, and he started to get super pissed off, and Joy Epstein, the assistant principal, was outside and saw it and wagged her finger at him because she felt like he was going to start a fight, and she wanted to let him know, do not escalate this. Apparently this whole situation really upset Brandon because after this happened, he actually got a group of his friends together and tried to convince them to jump Elle. Fortunately, all of these friends were like, no, I am not down with that sickness. I'm not picking up what you're putting down. We're not going to go and beat up this kid. But Brandon was mad and Brandon was serious. And that day, he actually went up to one of Elle's friends and was like, you might want to tell your friend goodbye because you're never going to see them again. And apparently, Brandon said this within earshot of 6 different people. 6 different people heard him say this, but they didn't do anything. They didn't think that he was being serious. They thought he was just, talking shit. But then the next day, Elle was shot and killed. So now we move on to February 12th, 2008, the day of the murder. And on this day, Elle actually came to school dressed pretty toned down. They were just wearing tennis shoes, baggy pants, a collared shirt, and a sweater. Just nothing that would be offensive to some weak, I'm going to piss somebody off, but some weak little bitch fucking teenage boy who has an issue with how other people choose to present themselves. But they seemed a little bit off. They had a little bit of weirdness to their energy, basically, is how it was described. One of the teachers or one of the staff members said that Elle had told them that they didn't sleep well the night before and that they had actually thrown up their breakfast. And apparently this wasn't that weird. Apparently Elle threw up often because they had an issue with their weight, which is really sad. There's just so many things here. This is just so sad. And one other student said that they had seen Elle like walking through the quad and that they seemed off and that they were like looking over their shoulder a lot. Now, is this because they had any idea what was going to happen? I don't know, but this is something that they said after the fact. So it's first period, and Elle and Brandon are in the same class. This is their English class, and their teacher, this was Dawn, had moved the students over to the computer lab so they could work on their papers for World War II. So Dawn, Elle, Brandon, and 26 more students went on over to that class. And now what's so frustrating here is that Brandon had so many opportunities to change his mind, and he didn't, and he still did this. Like, okay. For example, when he left for school that morning, he forgot the gun. He forgot the gun. He was about to leave. His dad was driving him to school, and he was like, oh, wait, one second. I forgot something. And he went inside, and he got this gun. It had 6 hollow point bullets loaded in it. He wrapped it up in a towel, and he put it in his backpack, and he brought it. And then, at some point during the class, Elle actually left the classroom for a while. They left the classroom for a period of time, and during that time, Brandon said he thought about changing his mind. He was getting cold feet. He was putting his hands in the pocket. He was touching the gun, and he was like, he was considering not murdering somebody that day. It's just so upsetting. It's so maddening that he still did it. And then Elle came back into the classroom, and Brandon could hear Elle talking to the teacher, and this is when Elle told the teacher that they wanted to start being called Letitia. And it's at this moment that Brandon was like, I'm going to do it. Like, I'm going to do this. I'm not changing my mind. I am going to murder Elle. And then he did it. He got up. He walked up to Elle while they had their back turned, and he shot them twice in the back of the head. And their teacher, Dawn, said that this whole thing, the fact that this happened was so ironic that it happened on this day because the project they were working on was on tolerance. And what's horrifying about this, and I wasn't even sure if I was going to include it or not. I hadn't really figured it out, but I think I'm going to. I guess we'll find out for sure if it's still in the editing, is that Elle didn't die right away. And I wasn't sure if I was going to mention this, but I feel like really knowing the severity of what you do when you do something like this is important. So if there was anybody watching this that doesn't humanize people in these situations, now you can. You can see that this is real. It's not just like you shoot someone and they're gone and it's painless and that's it. No. Elle was still alive. They were laying on the ground. They were screaming out in pain, looking around, gasping, thrashing around, just in agony, while the police were called, obviously, right away. And Joy Epstein, the assistant principal, was down there, holding them, trying to calm them down, holding their head, speaking to them, trying to let them hear her voice because Elle knew her and wanted her to have wanted Elle to have some sort of peace. You know what I mean? Like, it's just... Now, the cops descended down on this school because they didn't know what was going on. They didn't know if there were more shooters. They didn't know if there were more victims. They had no clue what was going on. And this was after Columbine, so the response to school shootings was, like, intense, as it obviously should be. And the word had gotten out about what happened, that there was a shooting at the school, so all of these parents showed up, and there was this big line of parents just standing outside the school waiting for them to be able to pick up their kids and hoping that their kid wasn't going to be the kid that wasn't coming home that day. I'm sorry, school shootings really upset me. Now, Elle was transported to St. John's Regional Medical Center and was listed as being in serious condition, obviously, and Brandon was on the run, but he didn't make it far. He was caught within 10 minutes, only 5 blocks away, and he was arrested and taken into custody. This was just so shocking because Brandon had grown up with guns. He had fired guns. He knew how they worked, and he knew what he was doing. This wasn't like a confused kid. When they searched his home, they even found a training video titled, quote, "Shooting in Realistic Environments," end quote. And it was not hard for Brandon to get access to this gun, and that's so maddening because there were guns everywhere in this house. He had so much access. He was living in a house with his dad and his grandpa, like in his grandpa's house, and his grandpa had so many guns. And in addition to having so many guns, they kept the ammo for these guns inside Brandon's closet, inside of a 14-year-old child's closet. So he was arrested. Brandon was arrested, and he was held on a $770,000 bill. Now, when Brandon's parents found out what he did, they were hysterical. They were just like, how could he do this? And they said they felt so bad for Elle's parents. And then they felt bad all over again because they couldn't bail their son out. They could not afford to bail Brandon out, so he was going to have to sit in jail and await trial. And I guess this was like incredibly heartbreaking because Brandon is a kid, right? He's 14 years old. He doesn't understand what's going on. Well, he understands what's going on to an extent, but he doesn't understand why he can't go home and why his family can't afford this. And he was really hoping that he would get out on bail. So to tell him that he wasn't was just heartbreaking all around. So he sat in jail, and while he did, his family would put him together little care packages, something to make it less of an awful experience for him. And mostly all he wanted in these care packages was just like cheese and peanut butter and jelly, because kids love peanut butter and jelly. Like, something about that note just really shows you how young these kids were, how young Elle was, how young Brandon was, and how young all the kids who witnessed this horrifying execution were. And what's super sad is in the documentary I watched, the kids who had been in the school who took part in this documentary said that they didn't receive like any counseling after this happened. And I guess some of the kids were even asking for counseling. They needed help and they just weren't getting access to that. And like, some of these kids had literally witnessed a murder of somebody they knew. And some of them had just heard that a murder had taken place at their school, and yet they were given nothing. They had to try to like deal with this themselves, which is just horrifying. And I guess part of the way that they dealt with it themselves is they actually created a little memorial for Elle near the flagpole where there were like candles and balloons and stuffed animals and things like that, which is like, okay, but what about all these kids who are going to be dealing with a lot of trauma? I feel like part of it is because they had no idea what the hell to do, because not to give them a pass or anything, because they should have like had some idea, but this was actually the first classroom fatality that had ever happened in Ventura County. So they just were inexperienced. Now, Elle had been in serious condition, but it was going to get worse because the next day they were declared brain dead. They were not going to be coming back from this. So the family decided to keep the machines on for a period of time so that their organs could be harvested. And 2 days after they were shot, the machines were turned off and Elle died on Valentine's Day. And apparently when Elle's mother left the hospital, she was greeted outside by a giant, beautiful butterfly, which is Elle's favorite insect. Now, because Elle had a rare blood type, they were able to donate 7 of their organs, and according to their father, the 10-year-old girl received Elle's heart on Valentine's Day. There are so many parallels here, actually. One of the interactions that was like the push for Brandon to murder Elle was Elle asking him to be their Valentine. Elle died on Valentine's Day. Their heart was given to a little girl on Valentine's Day, and Elle actually ended up being buried in a cemetery that was on Valentine's Road. Hundreds of mourners gathered at Elle's funeral and looked up at a large photo of them at the front of the room, and during the service, the Reverend said that, quote, "God knit Elle together and made them wonderfully complex. Elle was a masterpiece," end quote. And that was slightly edited, obviously, for, the name and the pronouns. When Elle was murdered, people all over the country were outraged. And that's actually why I'm surprised. Part of the reason I'm surprised I never heard of this case, because when this took place, I would have been like 20 years old. You would think I would have heard something, but I heard nothing. There were vigils and marches organized all over the U.S., and at a vigil in Ventura, 200 people carried pink and green glow sticks and candles and paper cups and walked down the boardwalk at the beach and stood under the stars to remember Elle. Over 1,000 students from Elle's school district even went out and did a 3-mile march to pay tribute. And this march ended up in front of the school, which makes sense. And dude, okay, there was this one teacher in the documentary, and I don't want to be a bitch, but she was an asshole. She was such an asshole. When she was talking about this march, she was like, I don't know why they did this march. I don't know why they ended up here. I don't know who orchestrated this. Why would they do a gay pride march here? I have so many questions. Like, this is her vibe, not my vibe. You know my vibe. I'm chill. This was her vibe. And honestly, it wasn't even just that part, but throughout the entire documentary, she was such an asshole. She was like, she was so victim blaming. She was like, Elle shouldn't have done this. Elle shouldn't have done this. They shouldn't have expressed themselves so publicly. I told Elle, like, you need to chill. You need to not do this. And she said she told that she told the principal that the principal needed to do something, because if they didn't, the boys were going to like drag Elle behind the school and beat him almost to death. Like, she was just like going off. I just got very hardcore homophobe vibes from her, in my opinion. And she even said, which is a bold thing to go on record saying, but she even said that if she was in Brandon's position, she didn't know if she'd bring a gun to the school, but there would definitely be a beatdown. So I say to her, with all disrespect, eat a dick, ma'am. And to answer her question of who orchestrated this gay pride march in her area, it was actually 2 sophomores, and they were blown away by the response. So were the local cops and the school officials. Like, nobody thought it would get so big. They had handed out flyers, but it was word of mouth that really got the word out, and so many people were there. It was mostly kids. There were no bullhorns, no speeches, no politicians, just kids, and kids from all different backgrounds. The goths, the punks, the jocks, all these kids were all there together, wearing bright colored clothes, marching down the street saying Larry, 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 because that was their name. And my brain went off. They were singing Imagine and Give Peace a Chance by John Lennon, and they even formed a little peace circle. Them being there sent a very clear and simple message to the world, and that was that the hate and violence needed to stop. On top of that, shortly after the murder, students from more than 7,000 middle schools and high schools and more than 1,000 colleges all got together to participate in the National Day of Silence. This day is meant to bring attention to anti-lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender name-calling, bullying, and harassment. And apparently this has been going on for a while, but on this particular day this year, it was being held in memory of Elle, and hundreds of thousands of children participated. This event was huge. Like Lance Bass and Larry King from CNN, the man who actually shared Elle's birth name, both put out PSAs to talk about the National Day of Silence. And actually, speaking of celebrities, a number of celebrities came out and spoke about their grief and their remorse and giving condolences over what happened to Elle. Hillary Clinton, Ellen DeGeneres, Janet Jackson, Taylor Swift, just to name a few, they spoke out and created a PSA that ran on MTV to raise awareness to what happened to Elle. And the MTV president at the time, his name was Brian, he said of this quote, "One more murder, one more life lost, one more attempt to provoke fear, and one more reason hate crimes must end. We hope this PSA will help inspire more people to join the fight against hate crimes." In addition to celebrities speaking out about what happened to Elle, there were also other victims of hate crimes who spoke out, and families of other victims of hate crimes who couldn't speak for themselves because they didn't survive what happened to them. Of these people who spoke out, one of them was Rodney King, which, if you're not familiar, maybe I could do a video on Rodney King, but he was a victim of a hate crime committed by the police. And he said, since what happened to me, what has changed? What have we done to improve this situation? Which he was implying that not much. And Judy Shepard actually spoke out. And if you don't know who Judy Shepard is, that's Matt Shepard's mother. And Matt Shepard, I did a video on Matt Shepard. It's incredibly heartbreaking. If you haven't seen it, I'll try to remember to link it. If not, you can search my page, my name with Matt Shepard, and it will come up. But she spoke out and said that what happened to Elle was, quote, "the most prominent gay bias crime since the murder of Matthew Shepard," end quote. Now, after Brandon was arrested, he and his family did not put out a statement or anything. I know I said that his parents were like, oh my God, I can't believe this. But this was actually just recorded on interrogation footage. They didn't put out an official statement. But their attorney did come out and say that, when Brandon was first shot, they were like, I'm so devastated to hear that, what? The attorney said that the family said that they were just so devastated to hear that Elle was brain dead. And I can only imagine that they were kind of shitting their pants when Elle passed away, when Elle died, because now it was a murder. And it was a very controversial murder because people were really split on how they felt. Even the two's teachers, they were like, yeah, Brandon committed a murder, but I feel like we failed Brandon. I can't believe we didn't realize that the bullying was mutual, and said that Elle would do everything they could to push Brandon's buttons to get under his skin, and also that Elle liked attention. Even the students were split. A lot of people were obviously heartbroken that Elle was killed, but I guess thousands of students signed a petition to have Brandon tried as a juvenile. Now, this was a topic of conversation because they were trying to decide in the court system if Brandon was going to be tried as a juvenile or as an adult. And Brandon did end up being tried as an adult. The judge determined, yes, he will be tried as an adult. And that's because Prop 21 had given prosecutors the ability to try anyone who was over the age of 14 as an adult. And Brandon had just turned 14, a month before the murder. So 14-year-old Brandon was going to be tried as an adult, and he was facing 51 years to life if he was convicted of the charges against him. There were multiple factors that went into them making this decision, the prosecutors making this decision to go after Brandon as an adult. That was a weird sentence, but you know what I mean. And one of the factors that they took into consideration was the fact that they believed that Brandon was, quote, lying in wait when he killed Elle. Now, Brandon's attorney was considering asking for a change of venue, but in the beginning of the court proceedings, they stayed in the Ventura County, and they just brought in a jury from Santa Barbara. So in August of 2008, Brandon stood before this jury in the Ventura courthouse and pled not guilty to the charges against him. And these charges were first-degree premeditated murder and a hate crime. Now, it took a while for the trial to begin, as these things sometimes do, but a few things did happen while Brandon was in jail awaiting trial. Elle's family ended up filing a lawsuit both against the junior high school and against Brandon's family. And in the lawsuit, it basically said that the school allowing them to wear makeup and feminine clothes was a contributing factor in their murder. Now, this wouldn't have been successful because, as I said, there were laws in place that protected Elle's sexual identity, gender identity, and they were allowed to wear clothes like that. But despite that, they ended up settling. They ended up coming to some sort of agreement because the family did get, I believe it was $275,000, like combined between 4 defendants. And this was the school system and also Brandon's family. And Elle's family said of this, quote, "Money won't bring our son back, but a lack of money in prison will ensure that the convict is denied the comforts he doesn't deserve." Anyways, back to Brandon. While he is in jail awaiting trial, he is seen by a psychiatrist and a psychologist, all that jazz, and he is found to be competent to stand trial. So that's good for the prosecution. They can get the ball rolling. And another thing that ended up being good for the prosecution was that while Brandon was in jail awaiting trial, he was in a couple of altercations. And these altercations, some of which were caught on camera, showed that Brandon was kind of an aggressive person because these altercations were started by him. And in the video, I watched videos of it, you can see that in at least 2 of the instances, they were unprovoked. He just like straight up attacks these people without them doing anything, at least in the immediate. In the immediate? Like, they're just sitting there chilling and he comes up and starts bashing them, basically. Maybe something happened previously to make him angry enough to do this, but it wasn't like they were fighting in each other's faces and pushing and then there was a physical assault. It was just like, this person's chilling and then here's Brandon assaulting them. So that wouldn't look good for Brandon, but they'd have to see kind of how that shook out at trial. And trial finally did begin in July of 2011, and the trial took place in the Chatsworth Courthouse in Los Angeles because Brandon's attorneys were successful by this point at getting a change of venue. Now, this trial started out with a bang because on day one of the trial, Brandon's brother James had to be like barred from the courtroom. He wasn't allowed to come to any of the legal proceedings unless he was going to be called to testify. And this is because James had seen the jurors, at least some of the jurors, in like the hallway. If you've ever been to a courthouse, the way it's set up, it doesn't matter. Basically, James sees the jurors, goes up to them, which you're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to talk to jurors. It's a big no-no. Goes up to them and is like, "Listen, my brother's fate is in your hands." So the judge was like, "I'm going to need you to get the fuck out. You obviously can't be trusted to be here." So, defense, prosecution. The defense's strategy here was basically, they were going with the gay panic defense. They were saying that Elle was the aggressor. Elle was constantly provoking Brandon. Elle was sexually aggressive and overly flirtatious and would not leave Brandon alone. And the prosecution was like, "Listen, Brandon wasn't this like little bullied kid who was, incessantly picked on by Elle. Brandon was a tall, like handsome, popular kid. He had a lot of friends, and he wasn't like a nice, popular kid. He was one of those kids who was only nice to you if you were in the in crowd, and if you weren't, he wasn't nice to you. They were like, he wasn't like small, like Elle was small, Brandon was strong. He was in martial arts. He was in the Young Marines." And then they added that he was also a little white supremacist. Now, that might seem like it came out of nowhere, and that's because I've been sitting on this information a little bit. But apparently, when the police searched Brandon's home, they found all kinds of stuff. They found like a shit ton of guns. They found like 15 guns. And along with these guns, they also found Nazi and white supremacist materials. And they believe that Brandon shared these ideas with his family because this is what he was raised in. They had also found, quote, "literature and drawings depicting a racist skinhead philosophy," end quote, in Brandon's bedrooms. Bedrooms? One bedroom. He had SS, swastikas, and Nazi doodles in his school notebooks and at home. These things, by the way, his attorney did try to explain and was like, "Listen, he only had all of this stuff because he was doing a paper on World War II and doing a paper on Hitler specifically, and he was just really interested in the German army, and that's why he was drawing all these swastikas and stuff." But I saw a lot of these drawings, and I'll probably put up some photos. I don't want to put up too much of the stuff because it's fucking gross to me, but I'm going to call bullshit on that, and I don't believe that that is why he was making these drawings. And I'm not the only one who felt that way, because they did have a expert on white supremacy come and testify, and they testified to the fact that they believed that Brandon's hate-filled ideology is why he killed Elle. In the documentary I watched, it was revealed that Brandon actually had a mentor. This was a neo-Nazi skinhead named Matt, and he was an SSL member. And apparently, Brandon's brother introduced him to Matt. So basically, Brandon's brother learned that Brandon was interested in white supremacy. So he brought Brandon, this is what this documentary said, brought Brandon to this guy Matt and was like, hey, can you mentor my little brother and teach him, all things Nazi, all things racist? And his brother came out in this documentary and spoke and was like, listen, Matt, his mentor, was not all that bad. He wasn't this bad guy. He was just a guy who believed that, people should just date and marry within their own races to protect their genetics. On top of that, if all of that wasn't enough, one of Elle's friends and classmates said that Brandon called her the N-word. She was a black girl, and she said that Brandon called her the N-word and was known to call other people of color the N-word. And it is worth mentioning that Elle was a biracial child who identified as black. In addition to being gender fluid, maybe trans, we don't know. They didn't get to live long enough to figure out what was going on in their lives and to figure out who they were. And these are all things that Nazis don't really fucking like. Now, witnesses did come forward at trial that said that no, Brandon wasn't the victim. It was Elle. That Elle was constantly bullied. And not just by Brandon, but by a lot of the boys in school. The kids would call Elle offensive names behind their back and comment on their clothing and their shoes and their makeup. They also said that they never really saw Elle make any sexual advances on anyone, and any comments they made was just Elle flirting or messing around, harmless stuff. And I'm sure there's some people who are going to be like, that's not harmless, but I am going to get into that a little bit later, a comparison for you, but I'm just not quite there yet. Now, there were people who also spoke out positively about Brandon and negatively about Elle. It wasn't all people being like, Elle was great, Brandon sucks, because then there wouldn't be as much controversy, right? Even though I don't feel like it's super controversial. It is. But one kid's dead and one kid's alive. So somebody definitely did something worse here, is my opinion. But Brandon's martial arts teacher said that they were never worried about Brandon. He wasn't the kid to look out for. He was polite. He said, yes, sir, no, sir. And there was a teacher that testified that she had boys come to her and complain that Elle would seek them out or follow them into the bathroom. And she considered this to be sexual harassment. But when this teacher brought the information up to Joy Epstein told her, there is nothing we can do about it. And speaking of Joy, several people, after the murder happened, several people, including Gregory, Elle's adopted father, came out and said that they condemned Joy quite a bit, saying that they condemned her for allowing Elle to be who they were. They just didn't word it like that. They basically said that she was using Elle to push some sort of political agenda. And I just feel I'm not going to say that people don't do that, because I absolutely think that people do that. But I feel in this case, at least the vibe that I got, is that people just needed somebody to blame, because this is such a unthinkable, tragic thing to happen. And it's easier to be this happened because you failed than just be this happened because society failed. Now, Gregory, Elle's adopted father, had some hot takes. I felt not stoked reading some of the things that he had to say, but he said, for example, he said that he didn't even believe that his child was gay. He didn't believe they were on the spectrum of sexuality at all, which I thought was kind of odd, especially considering the fact that he then said that Elle had came out to them just as being bisexual, not gay, which, would be kind of on the spectrum a little bit, but whatever. But he also said, and this was the hottest take of all, that he believed that Elle was the aggressor. He believed that Elle was the bully. Elle was sexually harassing Brandon, and that Elle should have been stopped instead of becoming the poster child for gay rights. So there's that. And the defense kind of ran with this as well. The defense was listen, the school allowing Elle to wear traditionally female clothing, as long as it didn't violate the dress code, allowed Elle to sexually harass Brandon. And now this, so to some this might seem complicated, but now I'm going to simplify it a little bit. To anybody who thinks that what Elle was doing was overtly flirtatious, was sexual harassment, right, by making advances or flirting with Brandon when he didn't want it, I pose this question. If a 15-year-old girl who Brandon had no interest in, was doing the same thing. Was going up and talking to him, was flirting with him, etc., etc. And Brandon walked up to this little girl and shot her twice in the back of the head and killed her. Would you be saying the same things? Would you think it was inappropriate? Would you think it was sexual harassment? Would you think like, oh, she kind of brought it on herself, it was mutual bullying? Or not? Because if not, it kind of sounds like the issue here is their sexuality, Elle's sexuality, and not their behavior. Anyways, Elle's teacher, Dawn, the one whose class they had been in when they were killed, testified, and she said that she had sort of counseled Elle. Like I said, they were close, remember, in the beginning, Elle brought the teacher a Dixie cup of flowers. Like, they had a close relationship. And she said that she would talk to Elle, she would try to counsel them through what they were going through. And she said that she even told Elle, like, you have to be careful. You can't wear things like this if you don't want negative attention. She said you can do what you want, but you just need to be prepared to be strong enough to deal with the world and how they're going to accept you for it, which is incredibly sad, but, you know, it's not inaccurate. You have to be strong enough to deal with the world around you because some people are just raised differently. Dawn also gave Elle this, like, strapless green chiffon gown. It was like this, kind of like a prom dress. I think it was her daughter's prom dress at some point, she said. And she gave Elle this dress with the intention of them being able to wear it outside of the school because she was supportive of Elle, like, finding themselves. Dawn came out and said she didn't see an issue with her giving Elle this dress. She saw this interaction as just a private moment between the two of them because they had such a close relationship, because she had sort of mentored them in a way and would talk to them, you know, about how they dressed and their makeup and things like that. It was clear that she did mentor Elle a little bit because she also said during this testimony that, like, she had inside knowledge. She said that the reason that Elle was taken away from the home, from the King home, is because they were being beaten. And this was a comment that was quickly stricken from the record, right? And it's a comment that Greg completely denies, but she did say that. So she obviously was talking to Elle about something. And when it came to the dress, she said, like, I knew they couldn't wear it at school, so I didn't think it was a big deal. Now, she did end up actually losing her job because of this, because, again, it was kind of a gray area, because there does need to be some boundaries, right, with teachers and students, adults and kids, especially if it's something like a kid's parent doesn't want, but then I'm also like, shit, the kids like this that don't have the support that they need from their families need support from somebody. So it's definitely like a sticky situation. I don't know what the right answer is. Let me know what you think about that. But she did end up getting a job as a barista at Starbucks for a while, and she was just like having a real rough time. Everything bad was kind of happening at once, you know, and she had a lot of guilt and a lot of trauma. She had post-PTSD from watching a student that she, like, loved get murdered in her classroom. Like, it got so bad that she even overdosed on drugs, and she tried to take her own life a few times. She ended up even being on life support for like 3 days after one of these attempts because she was just like so racked with guilt. And apparently Brandon even like knew that what he did had caused her guilt because he wrote her a letter while he was in jail apologizing to her for what he did in her classroom and saying, like, this wasn't your fault, basically. I'm sorry if you have guilt. Like, this wasn't your fault. But moving on. Anyways, back to the trial. During the trial, a photo of Elle holding up this green dress was shown and people were crying. It was a very emotional moment. And Gregory, Elle's father, got very upset and like stormed out of the courtroom. He was like, absolutely not. I'm not looking at this. It really upset him. And then he came back in the courtroom and he actually collected his family. He's like, we're leaving for the day. This is about enough of this. And so they're about to leave. And as they're on their way out, apparently the prosecutor's daughter, who was 13 years old, was in the courtroom. I don't know why she would be here for this kind of trial because it seems like such a traumatic thing, but she was with like another relative. And as they walked out, Elle's mother, their adopted mother, Dawn, like started cussing out the 13-year-old, like started like verbally abusing the 13-year-old. And it just got very messy. And it actually made it so that the judge was like, you can no longer be at the trial. So Elle's adopted mother was banned from being there for the rest of the trial because of this outburst. Now, after 8 weeks of testimony and almost 100 witnesses, none of which were Brandon, by the way, he never testified at this trial, the jury was sent to deliberate. Unfortunately, though, they were not able to come up with a decision. They reported that they were, quote, hopelessly deadlocked, with some jurors believing Brandon should be convicted of manslaughter, some believing he should be convicted of second-degree murder, and some believing he should be convicted of first-degree murder. And because of this deadlock, the judge declared a mistrial in this trial, and they were going to have to do it all over again if the prosecution decided to bring charges again. The very next day, the prosecution announced that yes, they would be retrying Brandon for the murder of Elle, but this time they would be doing so without the hate crime charge. They were going to drop the hate crime charge. Now, I want to tell you something about this first jury because it really pissed me off, but then we will move on. So in the documentary I watched, there were interviews with 3 of the women who were on the jury. And these women, in my opinion, are just like awful people. They basically said that the whole thing was Elle's fault and that Brandon was just, quote, solving a problem. They said that Brandon was just pushed into a corner and did what he felt like he had to do to get out of that corner. They said that Elle saying they wanted to be called Letitia was the green light for Brandon to do what he had to do, and that if Elle had not done that, they would still be alive today. Not that if Brandon hadn't brought a gun to school and shot them in the head, they'd be alive today. If Elle hadn't wanted to be called Letitia, they'd be alive today. It is so frustrating. It is so frustrating. Several of the jurors from the first jury even went as far as raising money for Brandon's defense for his second trial. Okay, they said that they don't believe that he should have been, tried. Yeah, that his charges should have been first-degree murder, for one. They definitely didn't think he should have been tried as an adult, too. Even though they admitted, they said, yeah, it was definitely premeditated, but it shouldn't have been first-degree murder, and he shouldn't have been tried as an adult. Even though, during their jury selection, they said that they would be able to convict a 14-year-old of first-degree murder. Apparently, they weren't honest when they said that, because otherwise they wouldn't be saying this now. And during this interview, this clip that I watched, they were all wearing these bracelets that said Save Brandon. One of his defense attorneys even got Save Brandon tattooed on their wrist. I wasn't even going to mention that, but she was like, oh, I just felt such a connection to this kid. There's something about him I can't get over it. She got Save Brandon tattooed on her body. Now, 2 weeks after the first mistrial in November of 2011, we did not get a second trial. Instead, we got Brandon entering into a plea agreement. He ended up pleading guilty to second-degree murder, manslaughter, and use of a firearm. The courtroom was full on this date, with a lot of people sitting on Elle's side and a lot of people sitting on Brandon's side. On Brandon's side, there were a ton of people wearing, Save Brandon bracelets with these matching scarves. Even jurors from the first trial were there on Brandon's side. And then on Elle's side, there were family members for Elle, friends for Elle, people who had driven up from Boston, and they were all wearing these little buttons that said Justice for Larry that just had a photo of Elle with them smiling. It was at this time that victim impact statements were read, and Gregory, Elle's adopted father, had a lot to say. Now, I'm going to be quoting Greg here, and Greg refers to Elle as Larry and as his son, so just know that they're direct quotes, so this is what he was saying. And during this whole victim impact statement, he said that Brandon was a white supremacist who plotted to assassinate Elle, basically, was what he was saying. And then he said specifically, quote, "The convicted murderer sitting at the defense table did much more than simply kill our son. He robbed us of one son and stole from his brother a lifetime of companionship, leaving him instead a lifetime of grieving. He subjected his own family to shame, guilt, and a profound level of remorse, emotions he has yet to display." He then added, quote, "I will never forgive you for what you did, murdering my son Larry. You took it upon yourself to be a bully and to hate a smaller kid. You have left a big hole in my heart where Larry was, and it can never be filled." Greg also acknowledged that his family were not the only victims here. He said that every single child who was in that classroom that day that watched one of their classmates be murdered right in front of them were also victims. He said that watching them testify, he could see how scarred they were. And then he said that this was these kids' 9/11. This was their loss of innocence. He then ended by saying that this was not a case of manslaughter. This was murder, plain and simple, and that the jury was incompetent, and that is why they deadlocked. The judge then had a chance to speak before sentencing Brandon, and they took this time to actually praise the jury and say that they did a wonderful job making a difficult decision. Brandon, who was 17 by this time, sat motionless and outwardly emotionless as the judge read his sentence. The only thing you could see about him that changed was the back of his neck turned a dark red. The judge then sentenced him to 21 years in prison. This would be 11 years for the manslaughter charge, even though he also pled guilty to second-degree murder. He only got time for the manslaughter charge, so 11 years for that, and then 10 years for the use of a firearm. He would not be able to be eligible for parole early. He'd have to serve the entire time. And he would not get time served for the 4 years he had already spent in jail. Brandon was also ordered to pay a $10,000 fine for his crime. And the judge said of this, quote, "This crime, in my mind, is as serious as it can get." So Brandon was 17 at this time. So he would be remaining in juvie until he turned 18. And then he would be transferred to a prison. And there he will remain until he is 38 years old with no possibility of parole. Greg King said of this sentence, quote, I don't think that 21-year sentence is justice for my son, but I understand the reality that was facing the DA of trying to convict a defendant who was 14 when he committed the murder. And apparently the prosecution had tried to get more time. They had actually went to the defense with a different plea deal where they would have Brandon plead guilty and he would get 25 years to life, but the defense had turned it down, so this was like the best they could get. After sentencing, Brandon's attorney made a statement on his behalf where he said, quote, "He feels deeply remorseful and has stated repeatedly that if he could go back and take this back, he would do it in a heartbeat. And he lives with this every day. Brandon wanted to express his remorse to not only the King family, but to all the children who were involved and everyone who had to go through this process." Brandon's mother was devastated, too. She cried a lot through the whole trial and really, really cried when Brandon pled guilty to the charges because she was seeing that her baby son was going to go to jail for 21 years. And that was really hard. And she said she has like a ton of guilt. She said she has a lot of guilt because I guess Brandon actually called her the morning of the murder. And she didn't answer the phone. And she just like, that's what gets her because she's like, man, what was he calling for? And if I had answered, could this have played out differently? Now, she's dealing with this, but she's not exactly dealing with it alone because she has family. She has her other sons, but she is now dealing with it as a solo parent. Like, okay, she was already dealing with things as a solo parent because her and William, Brandon's father, were divorced. But, I mean, William was still technically his father, so he was still dealing with it as well. But actually, Brandon's father died before Brandon ever even went to trial. It was March of 2009, and it was actually the day that Brandon was going to be going to the courthouse to find out if he was going to actually face trial. And that morning, Brandon's father was found dead in his home. I guess William was discovered in his home at around 8 a.m. that morning when his friend actually came to pick him up to take him to the courthouse. And it turns out that he had died as a result of a head injury from a drunken fall. And it's actually really sad because people said at that time when it happened, like, it looks like karma's coming early for Brandon. So as of now, Brandon is 29 years old. He is still in prison. He's actually in Folsom Prison, a la Johnny Cash. And while in prison, he has gone on to get his diploma, like he finished high school and he got his diploma. So now, let's go into the aftermath. So L's school decided that in the wake of this, they wanted to create an environment that was more welcoming and safe feeling for youths like L. So they created a group. It's the Gay Straight Alliance group called PRISM, and this group meets every Tuesday afternoon. Their hope is that their presence means that a tragedy like this won't happen again. With kids coming out younger and younger, they feel like the existence of groups like this in middle schools are important. And they've said that they know people will always think they're pushing an agenda, but they're not trying to push an agenda. They just don't want any more children being murdered in their classrooms. In addition to that, an Australian willow tree was planted on campus. I believe this was by one of Elle's friends, or like it was done because of one of Elle's friends, and this was put up as like a place where people could always go and remember Elle. And because, you know, trees grow for years and years and years, so there will always presumably be this tree there for like decades where people can remember Elle. Unfortunately, though, the school would not allow them to put a plaque up with Elle's name. Like, they didn't want it to be commemorated in that way. And the student who wanted this to happen, Elle's friend, said that they believe that the school did this because they just kind of wanted this whole situation to go away. It's just really sad to me, dude. This whole case is incredibly sad to me, and it just shows me, like, this case shows me that homophobia and transphobia was understandable and even rational to a lot of people back then. And when I really think about it, it hasn't changed all that much, because if you really look at what's going on right now, it's terrifying. I just really hope that one day we can move past this mindset. I really hope that one day people can be more understanding and more tolerant, but I don't know. I don't know if that will ever happen, if I'm honest, just because I don't have a lot of faith in people. And it's very sad, because how many more people are going to be killed for just trying to be who they are? And with that, I want to end this video with a quote. This is a quote from the prosecutor on Elle's case that I feel like sums this up very perfectly. The prosecutor said, and I quote, "When you ask me if Larry died in vain, the answer to that, with or without any trial, is yes. He simply shouldn't have died. The trial of Brandon McInerney is neither here nor there when it comes to Larry's death. It highlights how intolerant we are. The intolerance is to such a degree that people bring it with them wherever they go, even in the jury box. And until we become a little more forgiving, a little more open-minded, I think that as a society, then tragic events like this will continue to be in vain." And with that, my friends, is the story of the tragic murder of Elle King. I hope you found my presentation of it to be informative, and I hope it made sense. And of course, I just want to thank you for remembering L with me today. And now, considering all the information I've given you, I want to revisit the question of the day, and that was this. Do you believe that the sentencing in this case was justice? And do you believe that this should have been treated as a hate crime? Let me know all your thoughts in the comments below, because I'm very curious. I feel like it'll be divisive. I hope people are respectful, but I'm very curious as to what you think. My name is Brittany or Bratterstein, whichever you prefer, and today we're going to be discussing a really heavy one. We're going to be discussing a horrific hate crime, and that is the murder of Gwen Araujo. Now, this is a case that was suggested to me by a subscriber named Medina. Don't worry, ma'am. I saw all of your comments. I know you've been commenting it a little while, and I finally got to it, and I had never heard of this case prior to your suggestion. And now that I have, oh my God, I can absolutely see why this one resonated with you and stuck in your head. It is so fucked up. I am amazed that this case isn't discussed more because it is so horrific. And for just like the briefest of synopsises, basically what happened in this case is in October of 2002, 17-year-old Gwen Araujo was murdered at a house party by a group of men who became enraged when they learned that Gwen was a transgendered woman. That's the bare bones of this case, but there is so much to it. From the numerous partygoers who did and said nothing, to the insane, in my opinion, rulings at the trials, and yes, I said trials, plural, it's just enraging, quite frankly, and incredibly disappointing. So today I'm going to tell you that whole story, and I just want to say right off the bat that I am not, in my opinion, the most well-versed on all the terminology that might be appropriate in a case like this. I'm not as versed as I think that I should be, but I definitely do the best I can to learn as much as I can and to take information from those who know more than me or have life experiences that can open my eyes and make me see things for what they are. And just note, I'm going to be as respectful and appropriate as possible, and if there is any sort of misquoting or me saying anything that might be seen as disrespectful at all, it's completely from a place of a lack of information and not hate, because I've got nothing but love for all my trans brothers and sisters. I've got nothing but love for everybody except for people who suck, quite frankly. So that's that on that. With all of that said, come gather around and let me tell you the story of the horrific hate crime that was the murder of 17-year-old Gwen Araujo. Gwen Amber Rose Araujo was the second to 4 children, and she was born on February 24th, 1985 in Brawley, California, to Edward Araujo Sr. and Sylvia Guerrero. Her parents' marriage did not last, though, and the two were divorced when she was only 10 months old. Inside, Gwen had always felt like a girl. At a young age, Gwen told her family that she was, in fact, a girl, despite being born biologically male. Her family fully accepted her and loved her no matter what. When she was a child, her sisters enjoyed dressing her up and doing her hair, and Gwen loved doing hair and makeup and wanted to go to cosmetology school and move to Hollywood. Gwen was a beautiful person inside and out. She was always the life of the party, always making people laugh, and she was murdered in Newark, California on October 4th, 2002 at the age of 17. The 90-pound Gwen was killed by 4 men, 2 of whom she had been sexually intimate with, who beat and strangled her after discovering that she was transgender. Though Gwen knew from a very young age that she was different and she had felt like a girl trapped in a boy's body from the time she was very young, she didn't officially come out to her family until 1999 when she was 14 years old. And at that point, she started living her life as a girl, as a woman. She toyed with different names. She went by the name Wendy for a while and also the name Lita before mostly settling on the name Gwen. She loved the name Gwen because it was the name of her favorite singer, Gwen Stefani. And from that point on, she lived as a woman. She dressed as a woman. Everything was as a woman. She grew her hair out long. She began hormone therapy, and she had plans of getting the full gender reassignment surgery, but she was still pretty young. So there was a little bit of time before that was going to be able to happen. And in the meantime, she was just having to live her life as who she was in the body that she was born with. And this was hard because, as young as middle school, people were dicks about it. People made fun of how she dressed. People made fun of the way her voice sounded. And she ended up having a really tough time with that. And in high school, it got so bad that she transferred to an alternative high school before eventually just dropping out altogether. Gwen's mother said of Gwen, and this is Gwen's mother talking about Gwen prior to Gwen coming out as transgendered, and just keep in mind that Gwen's mother has since changed a lot in her mindset, her pronouns that she uses, things like that, both in regards to Gwen and also to like all other trans human beings like her. But at the time that this happened, her mother didn't even know what transgender was. Like culturally, it was a big thing as well. Like it wasn't a thing that she understood. So this quote is a little bit dated, but I thought it was still worth sharing with you. So Gwen's mother said of Gwen, and I quote, "He felt feminine and never felt masculine. I never understood what he felt. He came out 3 years ago and still was confused. Being who he was very painful. He felt like a freak." Gwen Araujo first met Michael Magston, Jose Morel, Haran Neighbors, and Jason Cazares in late August or early September of 2002 at a house party where she introduced herself to the men as Lita. The night the group met, they hit it off really well. All the men were pretty attracted to Gwen, and she seemed to be attracted to them. They like flirted and just kind of had like a good time. So they decided that they wanted to keep in touch, switch numbers. I don't know if social media was a thing in 2002. Time escapes me. I think it was. Either way, they decided that they wanted to keep in touch and be friends, so they decided to do just that. But it was after Gwen and the men had separated that one of the men kind of started to get an idea in his head, wondering if Gwen was biologically female. This was Haran Neighbors, and he asked his friends, like, "Do you think that might have been a dude?" But none of the men took it seriously or really thought much about it after that. It didn't take long after that for the men to get back together with Gwen. Jose Morel had, with his brother, him and his brother were renting a house that was considered like the party house, so they often had house parties there. And it was at one of these parties that Gwen came over, and she often came over after they officially started hanging out. She would often come to these house parties to hang out and she kind of became one of the people who was often there. If you've ever had like a house party house, you know what that's like. There's just people always kind of cycling through there, and Gwen was one of them. And it was at one of these house parties that Gwen and Michael Magdson, his last name messes me up. I'm just going to call him Michael. Gwen and Michael, and Gwen and Jose Morel, who, rented the home, became intimate. Not like the three of them together, two separate occasions where she was intimate with these men. And during the activities, she would tell them that she was on her period so that they wouldn't try to touch her. Because, she hadn't had her gender reassignment surgery. She didn't want them to, know that, I imagine, is why. And so they would just do other stuff. And I'm not going to get into what stuff, because it doesn't matter. You can look it up or use your imagination. In one of the articles I read, they had been interviewing different people, and they had interviewed another transgendered person. And this person's quote when talking about Gwen I thought was important, because I know there's going to be some people who think that she was like fucked up for not telling these guys in the first place that she was transgender. And I just think that this is a good quote to, come to her defense, I guess, a little bit. So this person said of Gwen, and I quote, "She was by no stretch a perfect person, no Rosa Parks. She was just acting as who she was, a precocious young teenage girl. She was transsexual, and she was killed for that." On the night of October 3rd, 2002, Gwen attended one of these house parties. And what happened to her that night is horrifying and unimaginable. But it ended with Gwen murdered, driven hours away from her home, and buried in a shallow grave. But we're going to get into the specifics of what happened at that party a little bit later. So Gwen was not like totally a creature of habit, but a creature of habit enough that when Gwen didn't come home after the house party, her mother was worried. So on October 5th, she went to the police department, and she did try to file a missing persons report, but it wasn't taken very seriously. And now why it wasn't taken seriously is up for debate. It's theorized that part of the reason is because she was transgendered. And another reason was that Gwen was known to go to these parties, and some say that she wouldn't always come home the very next day, so they just didn't really think that her being gone was unusual, but her mother did. It didn't take long, however, for Gwen's family to start hearing rumors. They even got to Gwen's aunt, and the rumor was that a transgender girl had been outed at a party, had been killed for it, and was buried out in Tahoe. So as soon as her aunt heard this, her aunt called the police and told them what she had heard. And once police heard this, they started to take it a little more serious, and they started actually going out and investigating the disappearance. And they went and they started talking to Gwen and to all of her friends, which led them to the Merrill house because that's where she was known to party. And from there, they started interviewing all people who would come and go from those parties. And a clearer picture of what happened the night that Gwen disappeared started to come into focus. So 2 days after Gwen went missing, Haran Neighbors, you remember Haran Neighbors was one of the guys that Gwen had partied with, had been having fun with. Well, he was breaking. He was crumbling under the weight of what had happened. And he actually talked to a friend of his. And he told this friend what he and 3 of his friends had done, a horrible thing that he had done. And this friend, upon learning about what happened to Gwen, did the right thing and immediately called police and told them what he knew. So this all happened pretty quickly after Gwen went missing. And this friend even agreed to wear a wire and to try to talk to Haran more. I hope that's how you say his name. It's Haran. Jaron. Jaron? That can't be right. It's got to be Haran. If it's not, I'm sorry. I don't really care. This guy is, they all suck, so whatever. Anyways, his friend agrees to wear a wire and decides to talk to him to try to get police more information. And when he does, he speaks to Haran, and Haran is just a mess. He tells his friend that, he's super nervous and that police want him to tell them everything, but that he's no narc. And his friend's, trying to calm him down. And it's it's okay, dude, don't even worry about it. Everything's fine. And he's, not having it. He's bro, of course I have to worry about it. The police know everything. So police take these recordings and they confront Haran. And they're like, so what's up, dog? Clearly something's going on. Clearly you know something. Otherwise you wouldn't say this. And confronted with this information, he cracks and he agrees to lead police to Gwen's body. On October 15th, so 2 weeks after her murder, Gwen's body was found wrapped in sheets, hog-tied, and weighted down with rocks in a shallow grave, only 3 feet in the ground in the Sierra Nevada foothills. Gwen Araujo was mourned in a public funeral on October 25th, 2002. And you want to be really fucking pissed off? I don't know, this will piss you off for sure. Members of the Westboro Baptist Church threatened to come to the funeral and picket the funeral. Fuck these people, man. They didn't actually, for your peace of mind, they didn't actually do it, but the fact that they even threatened to do it just immediately pisses me off. I fucking hate some people, man. This is the type of people I'm talking about. I have love for everyone unless you fucking suck. These people fucking suck. Anyways, they didn't show up, so good for them. Good for them. The theme of the funeral was butterflies because that was Gwen's favorite symbol. I can only imagine that that's because it's the symbol of change and of changing into who you are and who you really are and beauty and all of that. And since that was the theme of the funeral, there was a large cloth butterfly laid over Gwen's casket, and her mother released 17 butterflies into the sky, one for every year that Gwen had been alive. And she said of Gwen during her funeral, and I quote, "Take your flight, beautiful butterfly, take your flight." And I'm sorry, that was actually Gwen's aunt who said that at her funeral, not her mother. But take flight, beautiful butterfly, take your flight. Gwen's funeral was just full of people, dude. Both people who knew her and people who didn't know her. People who were just affected by her story and what had happened to her and the reasoning that it had happened to her. It was a very traumatic thing for a lot of people because it's such a fucking horrible thing to happen. And Gwen's own grandmother ended up fainting during, passing out during the funeral and needed medical attention. Students that were going to be performing in the show The Laramie Project, which if you haven't heard about it, I mention it in my Matt Shepard video. I'll link that. I'll try to remember to link it up. Either way, if you search the Matt Shepard case, you'll find it on my channel. It's a really absolutely horrible case, and it goes more into what the Laramie Project is. But students who were going to be in the Laramie Project came to Gwen's funeral, and they came dressed as angels, and they stood outside the church and they sang Amazing Grace. The priest conducting Gwen's funeral said, and I quote, "There are people out there who are against what you are gathering here for. Let's love them too. Otherwise, what is not understood about other people becomes violent." A candlelight vigil was also held for Gwen on another date at a park that wasn't far from her home, and more than 200 people attended this candlelight vigil. So though she had like a lot of bullies and a lot of problems at school with people who just weren't accepting of who she was, there were still a number of people out there who cared for and loved her. Once Gwen's body was recovered, the police quickly moved forward on arresting 4 men. And the 4 men that were initially arrested were Michael Magnuson, Haran Neighbors, Jose Morel, and Jose Morel's older brother, Paul Morel. But Paul was quickly released because once they started looking into it further, 2 witnesses who were there at the house party the night of the murder came forward and said that Paul left the house before the crime ever took place. So he wasn't actually there. He was just initially arrested, probably because it was his home. The 2 witnesses who came forward and said that he had left were his girlfriend and his brother. His girlfriend was Nicole Brown, and his brother was Emmanuel Morel. And you might want to keep those names locked in your head a little bit because they do come back. Emmanuel comes back just like in a little bit, but definitely Nicole Brown comes back into the story. Fucking Nicole Brown. Michael, Haran, and Jose were all charged with murder on October 17th, and they were all held without bail in jail. Without bail in jail. It's a good sentence. Yeah. Jose Morel's mother, upon learning what had happened, wanted to get a message to Gwen's mother. And this message was, and I quote, "I'm sorry for what happened to her son." This is her referring to Gwen, just so you know. "I didn't raise my sons to do something like that. But if my son did take part in this murder, then he's where he's supposed to be." Another man ended up being arrested in relation to Gwen's murder, and this happened after Haran Neighbors. You remember Haran? He was in jail. After he was arrested, he was in jail, and he wrote a letter to his girlfriend. And in the letter, he wrote about how the group had planned a Soprano-type hit to kill the bitch. Fucking this guy, even in jail, he's still being a son of a bitch. And this letter was, of course, intercepted by police because if you're writing letters from jail, the police can read your letters. And in going through the letter, they also found that there was another man who was implicated in this letter in Gwen's murder. And this was a man named Jason Cazares. Jason Cazares. So he was arrested on November 19th, so about a month after the other men were arrested. And prior to him being implicated in this letter and being arrested, he was being treated by police as just a witness. So I'm sure he was really stoked on his friends for opening their big mouth and getting him arrested as well. But I mean, I'm glad that they did. So speaking of Haran Neighbors ended up coming to a deal with the prosecution in which he would plead guilty to voluntary manslaughter as opposed to being charged with murder. And this came with a sentence of 11 years. And in exchange, he would testify against the other 3 men at trial. During the entry of his plea, the judge did warn him that he could still be charged with murder if the prosecutors found that he wasn't, quote, living up to his end of the bargain. But during the trial, which began on October 14th, 2004, Haran Neighbors gave a detailed account of the murder and burial. And I'm going to tell you about it now, about what he says happened that night. On the night of October 3rd, 2002, Gwen attended one of the house parties held at the Merrill home like she usually did. And in attendance was Jose and Paul Merrill, who rented the home, their younger brother Emmanuel, Michael, Haran, Jason, and a friend of the group, somebody who was, I guess, Paul Morel's girlfriend, Nicole Brown. And the night was normal. It was just like a typical party. They were drinking, they were having fun, they were playing dominoes, everybody was chill. Even Gwen and Nicole Brown were chill. They had previously gotten in like a fist fight, and this night everything was cool. And I guess speaking of that fight, so you can know what had happened that night is, or what had happened during the fight between her and Nicole previously, is that I believe they had been at a house party and Nicole Brown had been trying to convince Gwen to do a striptease for the guys. And for some reason, this turned into a fight. You know, alcohol, tension, people aren't being their best selves. And they ended up getting into a fist fight. And during this fight, Gwen's strength was noted because though she was smaller in stature than Nicole Brown, Gwen was very, very scrappy and was able to win this fight. And Nicole got berated for it because Nicole was also a scrappy girl. She was like a guy's girl, you know, and she often won fights. But Nicole said to the guys, "Oh, well, she fights like a dude." But either way, they had this fight. Things, you sobered up, you decided you were cool, you were friends again, and everything was cool the night that Gwen was killed. The two had seemingly squashed their beef and were being civil. And they had even hung out that night, the night that Gwen was killed. They had even hung out. They went on a run to 7-Eleven to get more alcohol and more cigarettes. And Gwen had confided in Nicole at that time that she had a crush on both Michael and Haran. Now, the energy of the night changed when it started being discussed around the partygoers that Gwen might not have been born biologically female. Now, how this conversation started exactly, I'm not sure. There's different reports, but one of the reports I saw was that this came from Nicole Brown, that somehow the fight between the two of them had come up and like, oh man, how is it that you lost, blah, 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 blah. And that's when Nicole said, like, you guys saw she fights like a man. Regardless of how it came out, once it did come out, the men got very upset and they started kind of talking amongst themselves, going back and forth on how they felt and what they thought. And though there was a lot of ups and downs and like, no, it can't be, yes, it is, da 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 da, one sentiment that was repeated through all of them pretty consistently was that if this was true, if Gwen wasn't born biologically female, she was going to be in trouble. During his testimony, Haran said that Jose Morel said that night upon learning that Gwen might not have been born female, and I quote, "I swear, if it's a fucking man, I'm going to kill him. If it's a man, she ain't going to leave." He then told the court that in response to this, Michael Magson said, and I quote, "I don't know what I'm going to do." And then Haran said that in response to this, he himself said, quote, "Whatever you do, just don't make a mess." In the early morning hours of October 4th, 2002, Michael Magson went up to Gwen and told her that she needed to tell the truth about her born gender, or alternatively, and preferably, let him touch her genitals so that he could confirm himself. And she obviously declined this request. And at that point, Nicole Brown started to egg the men on, saying that somebody should forcibly inspect her. So at this point, Michael grabbed Gwen and forced her into the bathroom alongside him. About a half an hour later, when the two still hadn't come out, which I don't know what was happening in that bathroom for that half an hour, and I couldn't find it anywhere, but either way, about a half an hour later, Nicole Brown went into the bathroom, and that's where she found Gwen sitting on the counter, appearing very drunk. So Nicole decided to take it upon herself to spread Gwen's legs and look up her skirt herself. And when she did, she saw that Gwen did still have biologically male genitalia. And in response, she screamed, "It's a fucking man." And all hell broke loose, and all of the men in the house became enraged, became violent, became aggressive, particularly the men that Gwen had been sexually active with. Jose Morel just started to cry uncontrollably, and the other three men, Michael, Haran, and Jason, went outside to smoke and figure out what they were going to do. Nicole testified at trial that she tried to help Gwen at this point, and that she told Gwen, like, bro, they're fucking pissed. If I was you, I would leave. I would get out of this house. I would run, and I would run as fast as I can. But that when Gwen did try to leave the house, she was confronted with the three men who were outside smoking. So Michael, Haran, and Jason forced Gwen back inside the house. Emmanuel Morel, Paul and Jose's younger brother, also said that he tried to help Gwen and tried to get her out of the house, but that when he tried, he was prevented from doing so by Michael and Haran. And Jose was just beside himself, hysterical. He vomited upon learning and just kept repeating the sentiment of, "I can't be fucking gay." Nicole said that in response to this, she tried to comfort Jose and also tried to get Gwen out of the house, tried to get them to let her go, saying to Jose, and I quote, "It's not your fault. I went to high school with you and you were on the football team. Any woman who knows you after this, it's not going to matter. Just let her go." After Gwen was forced back in the house, Michael grabbed at her skirt, tried to rip it up and expose her genitals, and when Gwen tried to stop him, he punched her in the face, knocked her to the ground, and then put her into a chokehold and had to be stopped by the other men in the house. Gwen cried hysterically and begged for the men to stop, telling him, like, please, no, stop. I have a family. I have people who love me. But at this point, the men were so pissed and were sort of in a mob mentality and were just feeding off of each other's energy. Jose Morel, who had previously just been like crying and upset, was now super enraged as well. And he grabbed like a can. I think it was a can of like cat food, like an aluminum can. And he struck Gwen in the head, denting the can and cutting open her head. He then grabbed a frying pan and he struck her in the head with that as well. And the last words that Jose Morel heard Gwen say was, "I told you, I'm sorry." These are the last words he heard from her. Now, these two men that are being the most violent here, Michael and Jose, are the two men that Gwen was sexually active with, just in case you don't remember, since I was at the beginning of the story. Once the fight began and Nicole Brown saw how pissed off these men were, her, Paul Morel, and his younger brother Emmanuel all left the house. Nicole said that she knew that Jose wouldn't do anything. Jose wasn't capable of murder, but that she didn't know the other guys well enough to know what they were capable of. And that, she had two of her own kids at home that she needed to think about, and that Paul was also on probation. So they just wanted to get as far away from the situation as possible. Did they call for help? No. Did they do anything that could have helped Gwen? No. They just left. Shortly after Nicole, Paul, and Emmanuel left the house, Haran and Jason left the house as well. And they got in Michael's truck and they were going to drive to Jason's house to pick up shovels and a pickaxe while the other guys stayed at the home to, quote, kill the bitch. And it was testified by Nicole Brown at trial that after she and Paul and Emmanuel had left, they had kind of circled the block and drove back by the house. Why? I don't know. I don't really know the area, but she testified that she did see these men leaving in Michael's truck. So it was confirmed that this did happen. When the two men returned, Gwen was still alive. She was still conscious. She was sitting on the couch and she was bleeding from her head wound. And once Jose noticed that she was bleeding on the couch, he ordered her off the couch because he needed to clean it. And he started aggressively cleaning the bloodstain on the couch and on the carpet. Now, I don't know if he wanted to get rid of blood specifically or to get rid of evidence that something was happening. But either way, he cleaned up the stain and then he went into his room where he says he spent the rest of the night crying. After that, sometime after that, the assault against Gwen continued, with the other men egging Michael on, saying to knock the bitch out. And this is when he hit Gwen in the head with his knee, slamming her head into the wall as hard as he could. This hit was so hard that it knocked her unconscious. It dented the wall and it broke the plaster off the wall. And while Gwen was unconscious on the ground, Jason started to kick her. Once Gwen was unconscious, Michael then bound her wrists and her ankles and wrapped her in a bit of bedding to minimize the blood that was getting on the carpet. And then the group carried her out to the garage. The beating that Gwen endured was so bad. It was so bad that later at trial, the defense attorney tried to have photos of the crime scene omitted at trial because essentially they made his clients look fucking terrible. But the judge ended up disagreeing with him and most of the photos were admitted as evidence. But that just goes to show how bad it was that the defense was like, we can't even show the photos of the crime scene because it shows what fucking monsters you men are. Now, what specifically happened to Gwen and by who in that garage is unclear because it's at this point that the men just are all turning on each other and claiming that this person did it, no, this person did it, just deflecting blame altogether. But the general consensus is that Gwen was then strangled with a rope and hit twice in the head with a shovel. And the men said that when she was strangled, they weren't sure that she was dead, but once she was hit twice in the head with the shovel, they were certain. The autopsy showed that Gwen had died from strangulation associated with blunt force trauma to the head. Gwen was then placed in the bed of Michael's truck, and the four men drove her body a couple of hours away, burying her near the Sierra Nevada mountains in a shallow grave in the El Dorado National Forest. And apparently they were still just talking shit about Gwen as they buried her. There was no remorse there, dude. No coming to terms with what they had done. It's just so disgusting. And speaking of disgusting and a lack of remorse, on their way home from burying a girl in the desert that they had just murdered, they went through the drive-thru and they got a little McDonald's for breakfast. How do you eat after something like that? I just don't understand people. Haran neighbors testified that, quote, he couldn't believe anyone could ever do that. And that Jose Merrill added, while burying Gwen, that, quote, he was so mad he could still kick her a couple more times, end quote. It is worth mentioning that Haran also believes that his friends were raped by Gwen because Gwen, quote, didn't come clean with who he really was, using male pronouns. and that he believes his friends were raped because his definition of rape is forcing sex on someone, and that Gwen had forced homosexual sex onto his friends. And when asked, like, how exactly did Gwen force them? He said, quote, through deception. Anyways, later that day, the day of the burial, Nicole Brown called the men to try to find out what had happened that night. She spoke to Jose on the phone and was like, things were fucking wild when I left. Like, what ended up happening? And Jose said to her, quote, let's just say she had a long walk home. It's just so frustrating, man. There were so many people who were at that party who didn't do anything, who heard about what happened after the fact and didn't come forward and tell anybody, just let her family, Gwen's family, worry. And during the investigation, police started to realize just how many people knew and didn't say anything. And they said that there was like 5 or 6 people who all knew what happened and were just all keeping their mouths shut. And it just makes me so frustrated. I don't understand it. And it's really gross. It's really gross. Anyways, on August 25th, 2006, Haran Neighbors received an 11-year sentence for his part in the crime because of the deal he made with the prosecution. Haran said before being sentenced, and I quote, I know my words offer nowhere near a sense of consolation. I do not forgive myself. I don't see how I ever can. Haran, after getting his only 11-year sentence, even though he had been there and had went and gotten shovels and did nothing to help, he got his 11-year sentence. Then he was given credit for time served, and he was released in 2016. Excuse me, I just looked at my notes. Sometime before 2016, so even sooner than that. Anyways, during the trial, Gwen's attorney, or not Gwen's attorney, the attorney for Gwen, though, the prosecution, was pretty disappointing. They used male pronouns when describing Gwen, and they used her dead name when talking about her as well. And it's just disappointing to consider, because these are the people who are supposed to be like speaking for her, and they're just kind of being a little bit disrespectful, maybe ignorant, probably ignorant, but either way, it's just not what you want to hear. But moving past that, they said that the men who had murdered Gwen had decided, and I quote, that the wages of Araujo's sin of deception was death. The defense tried to claim that these men should be charged with manslaughter and not murder because they were essentially freaked out beyond reason to learn that they had had sex with a man, and that they were essentially employing the gay/trans panic defense, which is like a branch off of the gay panic defense, which has since been made like no longer a thing in California. Fortunately, that defense can no longer be used in California. And this was actually done in Gwen's name with the help of her mother's activism. Her mother had made a promise besides her daughter's casket that she would be her voice until people stopped dying for who they are. But at the time, this was still an accepted defense, and this is the defense that the defense was going for. That essentially these macho straight men panicked at the idea of gayness and had to kill somebody about it. So fucking stupid. Prospective jurors for this trial were asked a series of questions. They were asked if they knew any gay, lesbian, bisexual, or trans people, or if they knew any same-sex married couples, or if they had ever interacted at any point with a human being that was transgendered. And then they were asked the very specific question of, quote, whether they had seen a movie or theatrical performance depicting the activities of a transgender person. I had to read that one. I wasn't going to remember that one. One of the defense attorneys explained that the reason that last question was asked is because they wanted to know specifically if prospective jurors had seen the movie Boys Don't Cry, which is based on the murder of Brandon Teena, or if they had seen the Laramie Project, which is based on the murder of Matt Shepard. I do have videos on both of these cases on my channel. Brandon Teena is one of the first ones that I covered like forever ago now. And one of those cases that first got me really into true crime as a child, because they're just both so fucked up. Just like Gwen's case, horrible hate crimes that will just destroy you from the inside out. But I would still suggest watching them if you want to. I will try to remember to link them. If not, you can search them on my channel, because they are important stories worth remembering and worth talking about. Anyways, this question ended up being removed, actually, from being asked to prospective jurors because it was believed that if they asked this question, that people would then go home and watch these movies, and in doing so, it would taint the jury pool. The DA said of this case, and I quote, "One can debate the propriety of one choosing to identify with a gender other than the one they were born with. But I trust juries to understand that people don't get to make life or death decisions simply based on someone's lifestyle. That's not a world in which I want to live or most people want to live in." After 9 days of deliberation, the first trial ended on a mistrial because the jurors were not able to come to a unanimous decision regarding the 3 men. The jury did agree that Gwen was murdered. I mean, that's pretty fucking clear, jury. But what they couldn't decide on was whether or not they all believed that it was premeditated. And so they couldn't come to a unanimous decision. Be jury was given the option to instead of be able to find the men guilty of second-degree murder or even manslaughter as opposed to the first-degree murder charge, which is interesting because I didn't know that was a thing. I thought like you charge them with something and they're voting on that. But in this case, they were given the option like, hey, if you don't think it's first-degree murder, you can find them guilty of second-degree murder or you can find them guilty of manslaughter. But in the end, the jury wasn't even able to make it past the first-degree deliberations, and so it ended on a mistrial. Publicity by transgender activists was actually given credit for informing the public about the type of tactics that the defense had been using to sort of blame Gwen for her own death. And right after the mistrial, Gwen's mother was granted petition. She was given permission to legally have Gwen's name changed to Gwen, and have her sex legally changed to female, so that at the next trial, the defense had to refer to Gwen as she and had to use female pronouns, which would drastically change, I believe, the jury's mindset when looking at this case. Gwen's mother also had Gwen's name legally changed to Gwen Amber Rose Araujo, and this was the name she had chosen when she was pregnant with Gwen in the event that Gwen had been born female. So she changed her name to honor her that way. The second trial began on May 31st, 2005, and the courtroom was packed for this hearing. Michael Magnuson, Jose Morel, and Jason Cazares were charged with first-degree murder with, quote, hate crime enhancements, which meant that if they were found guilty, their sentencing could be enhanced because of the fact that it was a hate crime. Now, you want to be annoyed with me? Like, maybe. I think you will. I like bringing you guys with me through my frustrations with cases, but maybe you won't find this frustrating. I don't know. Or maybe I'm taking this the wrong way, which is also true. But at the second trial, during Michael's portion, anyways, a tape was played, and it was a tape of Michael's interview with police where he first was arrested. And in this interview, you can hear the police officer essentially coaching Michael, okay? Telling Michael to use the trans-panic defense. Yeah. He said to Michael during this interview, and I quote, "The outrage and embarrassment you must have felt. I can only imagine. You'd be surprised. Moms, especially moms, if they knew the facts, you'd be surprised." Now, apparently, this cop was just trying to make Michael comfortable to get him to open up about the murder. Give him an out, hey, maybe this is why you did it. Cops do that, but I don't know. Something about it hits my ear a little fucked up. But that could just be me. I am also sensitive to those types of things personally, but let me know what you think down below. During the closing statements at this trial, one of the defense attorneys said that his clients were just, quote, ordinary human beings who were guilty at most of manslaughter because of their case of a classic heat of the moment crime. To avoid a second mistrial, the prosecution made sure to tell the jury, listen, we're going after a first-degree murder here. But if you can't come to a decision on that, you can give second-degree murder, or in just Jose's case, Jose Morel, he is open for manslaughter. Okay, so please make a decision. We would like first-degree murder on Michael and Jason, especially Michael, because they saw Michael as the ringleader that actually did the strangling of Gwen. So they're like, we would prefer that, but there are other options. And the prosecutor said of Michael Magnuson, and I quote, this is actually a loose quote, so it won't be an and I quote moment. He essentially just said that Michael Magnuson was a poor excuse of a man with a stupid and moronic list of excuses for why he murdered Gwen. The defense tried to argue this, saying that this murder only happened because of a very, very specific and unusual set of circumstances that are very unlikely to present themselves again. So the chances of these men killing another person is highly unlikely, and that they didn't have criminal records, so they'd probably be just like A-okay. And the judge responded to this, calling this crime, and I quote, a brutal beating of a vulnerable human being. After a week of deliberation, Michael and Jose were both found guilty of second-degree murder. This is Michael and Jose. They were found guilty of second-degree murder, but they were not found guilty of the hate crime allegations. And later in an interview, a juror said that the reason that they convicted them of murder was, and I quote, the community standard is not and cannot be that killing is something a reasonable person would have done that night. This juror continued by saying, essentially, that they had not found these men guilty of a hate crime because they didn't really believe that it was a hate crime. They said that they didn't believe that these men had killed Gwen because she was transgendered, but they had killed her because, quote, of a situation that had just gotten out of control. But I have to respectfully disagree with that assessment because the situation got out of control because these men lost their cool because they learned that Gwen was transgendered, right? So, if she hadn't been transgendered, they wouldn't have lost their cool and they wouldn't have gotten themselves into a situation that they then couldn't control. But that's just me. The Human Rights Campaign president, at least at that time, I don't know if he's still the president, his name was Joe, and he said of Gwen's murder, and I quote, Gwen was brutally murdered because of hatred, and to claim anything else is the real deception. The prosecutor, Chris Lamero, said of this, and I quote, Gwen being transgender was not a provocative act. It's who she was. However, I could not further ignore the reality that Gwen made some decisions in her relation with these defendants that were impossible to defend. I don't think most jurors are going to think it's okay to engage someone in sexual activity knowing they assume you have one sexual anatomy when you don't. So, that's the prosecution, the person who is fighting for Gwen. And that's his opinion. And he, was entitled to it, I guess. Michael Magnuson and Jose Morel were both given 15 years to life in prison for second-degree murder. While Jose Morel showed great remorse and sorrow to Gwen's family, Michael showed none. He seemed pretty pissed off at the verdict and has shown literally zero remorse since being arrested. Now, you're probably sitting there like, wait a minute, there were 3 of them. What happened with Jason Cazares? Well, the jury was deadlocked on Jason with a vote of 9-3 in favor of him being guilty of murder. Yeah, that's a good sentence. To avoid having yet another trial, a third trial, Jason ended up pleading no contest to manslaughter and was given 6 years in prison with time served. Jason then asked the court if he could wait to start his sentencing until his child was born because his baby's mother was pregnant and his child was going to be born in just a couple of months. And the prosecution responded to this saying, and I quote, "It's difficult for me to entertain a request like that when Gwen Araujo is dead." But in the end, this request was granted. This guy got to wait and be on the outside and be present while his child was brought into the world before he started serving his time for murdering Gwen. In September of 2006, California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger signed the Gwen Araujo Justice for Victims Act into law. The law limited the use by criminal defendants of the gay trans panic defense by allowing parties to instruct jurors not to let bias influence their decisions, including bias against the victim based on his or her gender identity or sexual orientation. Then, in 2014, Assembly Bill would be signed into law, which further restricted the use of the gay trans panic defense. This meant that defendants could no longer claim they were provoked to murder upon discovering the victim's sexual orientation or identity. In response to Gwen's murder, Horizons Foundation, which is an LGBTQ+ foundation, announced the establishment of the Gwen Araujo Memorial Fund for Transgender Education that would be awarding grants to Bay Area school programs that promote understanding of transgender people. Gwen's murder had a ripple effect in both positive ways, like mentioned above, with the foundations and the memorial funds and the education, but also in negative ways where it applies to Gwen's family, as I'm sure you can only imagine. Gwen's mother, Sylvia Guerrero, prior to Gwen being murdered, was a paralegal, and she had worked in this company for a very long time. But after Gwen's murder, she started suffering from PTSD, and the last I read about her, she was homeless due to this, and had just been moving her items from place to place in a car that she had borrowed from a friend. She said of losing her daughter, and I quote, "When Gwen was murdered that night, it was the beginning of a life sentence for me and my family. Brandon, then 13, and Michael, then 10, lost their sister, and in many ways also their mother. I can never begin to make up for the time we lost as I struggled to deal with the grief that began that night." Now for a quick little Where Are They Now segment, I can give you some Where Are They Now. Haran Neighbors, as I said, served his time and was released sometime before 2016. Jason Cazares, the man who was there and said he was like outside smoking when it happened, the one that had the baby on the way, that guy, he did the same. He served his time and he was released. Jose Morel was granted parole in 2016, and this release was actually supported by Gwen's mother, Sylvia, though some of Gwen's family disagreed with this and thought that none of these men should ever get out. Sylvia was at least open to him being released because he did show remorse from the very beginning. From like the moment he was arrested, he was one that was showing remorse. And he said that in the beginning, he was honestly feeling mostly remorse for himself, and he felt sorry for himself, which honestly is at least honest of him to say. But that the gravity of what he had done didn't really hit him until he had his own child who died in 2011. So he got to see what an impact what he had done actually was because he experienced loss himself. He said of his crime, and I quote, "I am truly and sincerely sorry. I wish I could go back to that terrible day and erase it. I realize that you may never forgive me, but I ask that all of you at least try." Which I will say is a fucking tall order, because I know that some people can forgive. I don't know if I would ever be that person though. Like I might not. I don't think I'm that big of a person. I don't think I could. I don't think I'd want to. And I don't know if I think they deserve it. Like that's just my opinion, the truth. But I'm always in awe of families who can do that, because no. When Michael Magnuson came up for parole in 2016, it was determined that he was not ready to be released back into the public. Like he had not been reformed. And Gwen's mother, Sylvia, was also very against his release because he's just been kind of a dick and never showed any remorse. And when his parole came back up again in 2019, it was again denied because, again, he's never showed any remorse. And apparently he's also developed a pretty bad drug and alcohol problem while in prison. Gwen's mother, Sylvia, who in the wake of her daughter's murder has become a pretty open trans activist, has said of her activism, and I quote, "We still have a long way to go because people like Gwen are still being murdered for who they are. And there's families who are suffering like we are. We have a long way to go before a trans person can be free to live their lives, to live out their dreams and goals like they deserve." And I want to end this with one more quote from Sylvia about Gwen. And she said of her daughter's legacy, and I quote, "She didn't die in vain. In death, she has literally saved thousands of lives. I can't tell you how many people have told me, because of your daughter, I am free to be who I am." And with that quote, that, my friends, is the story of the horrible murder of Gwen Araujo. Isn't that just so sad, dude? These kind of cases, like, just break my heart. They're so upsetting. Just imagine being Gwen in that moment, being just hopeless and on the ground and surrounded by an angry group of men who you thought were your friends, who you thought cared about you, who who are just so mad and beating you and trying to kill you for just being who you are, and they end up strangling you. That's horrible, dude. It's unthinkable. I can't even imagine how scared and confused she must have been. And it makes me fucking insane. I cannot imagine just being that hate-filled. And man, the fact that this wasn't deemed a hate crime blows my mind, because it seems very clear. These men became enraged because they learned that Gwen was transgender. And they believed that she had tricked them. So they went into a rage and they killed her about it. Like, it seems very black and white to me. And please don't come with any victim blaming bullshit. It's not necessary. It's not helpful. It doesn't add to this. You don't have to say every thought that pops into your head. I don't know if you knew that. You don't have to. Because even if you believe that Gwen was a horrible fucking person and that how dare she do what she did, and she tricked these men and she raped them because she tricked them into homosexual sex by not being honest, she didn't deserve to die about it. And that is a hill I will die on. And honestly, any people who leave those type of comments just look like assholes. They're just announcing that they're dicks. So if you want everyone in the comment section to know you're an asshole, I mean, I guess go for it, but we'd prefer that you didn't. But anyways, guys, that completes this video. I hope you found it interesting and informative, and it gave you all the information you would want when looking into this case. And of course, I want to thank you for remembering Gwen with me today, because she was an important person worth remembering. These types of cases just make me feel so sad. I feel so sad for Gwen. I feel so sad for what she went through. And I feel so sad that she never got to, experience life or live life as who she actually was. She never got to go through the surgery. She never got to, have that full circle experience. And it's just so sad. And I can't even imagine what that's like to be born in the wrong body, how just trapped you must feel. And then to also have to live with the knowledge that some people will hate you so much just because that. It's just heartbreaking, man. My name is Brittany, or Bratterstein, whichever you prefer, and today we're going to be discussing Matt Shepard. And if that name doesn't sound familiar to you, I would be very surprised, because Matt Shepard's murder is one of the most notorious anti-gay hate crimes in American history. And it is absolutely horrible, so just mentally prepare yourself for that. This is a case that I definitely knew about. I was aware of it. I'd heard his name. I'd seen the famous photo of his face. I knew who he was, but I had never really taken the time to fully look into the details of the case. I just knew the Cliff Notes version. Oh man, and once you do, it is incredibly heartbreaking. And the more and more I read about the case, and the more I read about Matt, it just became such a bummer, because he just seems like the type of person to me that I would have really liked and gotten along with. And based on literally every single person who ever knew him's account, he just seemed like an amazing person who would have grown into such an amazing man and had a ton to offer. But no one will ever know what he could have done because of a couple of bigoted asshole wastes of space. And there is, a silver lining in Matt's case, because his death did bring a lot of positive change, but the cost is just incredibly high, especially considering what he went through. There's going to be a lot of details in this case that I'm going to tell you, just so you can see how completely horrible the men who did this to Matt were. The details are pretty intense. It's a pretty messed up case, so this is your trigger warning. I'm not gonna get gruesome, but I'm gonna tell you all the details. And while I tell you these details, if you're new here, I'm gonna be putting on a face of makeup. If that's not your thing, thanks for hanging out so long. But if you're kind of like, I'm not sure, that sounds a little weird, maybe stay and hang out. You might be surprised by how much you like it. So come, gather around, and let me tell you the story of Matt Shepard, the boy whose death changed the world. Matt Shepard was born Matthew Wayne Shepard on December 1st, 1976, making him a Sagittarius, and he was the first of two sons born to Judy and Dennis Shepard in Casper, Wyoming. Matthew was 5 years older than his little brother Logan, but the two grew up having an incredibly close relationship, even though the two were incredibly different growing up, where Logan was tall and athletic and a little more introverted. Matt was always smaller and not at all into athletics. That was not his thing, but he was a social butterfly. Despite these differences, Logan loved his brother and looked up to him like most little brothers do look up to their older brothers. When Matt was a child, he was an incredibly happy child, and his mission in life, even at that young age, was just to make people happy and to make people smile. He would walk around all adorable with his little stuffed animal, Oscar. It was a little stuffed bunny, Oscar, that he took everywhere with him. And he would always try to brighten people's days by he would write little poems, and he would find pretty little rocks and he would put them in people's mailboxes so that when they found them, they would be happy. And everyone in the neighborhood was just like, oh, that's Matt. This is definitely for Matt, because they just knew that that's the kind of kid that he was. As a child, Matt Shepard went to Crest Hill Elementary School, and he was known as being very friendly with all of his classmates. He was raised in an Episcopalian family and had served as an altar boy in church, so he was just like a good kid. But even though he was a total sweetheart and a total good kid, of course he was targeted and bullied a little bit, like normal. Kids are dicks. We all know this. Remember elementary school and junior high and high school? Oh. If you are young, it gets better. That's the first thing I'm going to say. Anyways, he wasn't athletic. He was just like a small boy. He was short. He was thin. He was light on his feet. He was the type of kid that was very into the arts and theater and not really into sports or any of that jazz. You know what I mean? He was that kid. It was very apparent to Matt's family from a very young age that Matt was probably gay, but he didn't come out to his family till years and years later. He was already an adult when he finally came out to his family, because he was just he was really afraid of what people would say, what they would think, what his friends would think, what his mom would think, what his dad would think. It was scary for him to consider making that leap, which I can't imagine. I feel like things are different now, but I am a straight lady, so it's not really a thing I've ever had to really consider of what that feels like, but it seems like a lot, because you never know. I guess you never know how people are going to react. Anyway, moving on. As a preteen, Matt attended Dean Morgan Junior High and then Natrona County High School for the first few years, and it was during this time that he started becoming very interested in and began educating himself in politics and current events. Matt was just very on top of what was going on in the world around him, which is incredibly impressive, especially for a young person, because most kids don't give a fuck about what's going on, but he was just a really impressive person, and he knew that he needed to know what was going on in the world so that he could effectively create change throughout his life. You gotta know what's going on if you want to know what to change, you know what I mean? He wanted to be a diplomat, and he wanted to do something great with his life, and he wanted to change things for the better and leave the world better than it was when he was brought into it. Matt's father described him as an optimistic and accepting young man who had a gift of being able to relate to almost anyone. And everything I read just describes Matt as exactly that. He was very approachable and friendly, and he was passionate about equality amongst all people. And he always stood up for people, no matter how different they were from him. It didn't matter. He was like, we're all the same, and I'm going to make sure you're treated as such. It didn't matter how different you were from Matt. He was the type of person who saw everybody's differences as strengths and something special and not something to discriminate for somebody for. And he was just described as a tender-hearted and kind person. Matt was also the type of person who could literally make friends with anyone. He wasn't that kid who had one specific friend group that he stuck around with. He was the type of kid that would literally float around from one group to another group to another group and could make friends with anybody. He was the type of person who would just walk up to you and start talking to you. You didn't have to know him. He would just see you, think you were interesting, and come up and be like, hi, I'm Matt. What's your deal? And I'm the bravery in that, because I could never. He would find out what the thing was about you that interested you or you were passionate about, and he would actually sit there and listen to you talk. He wasn't the type of person who would wait for his turn to speak. He would listen when you spoke, and he was even voted friendliest in his class. I just feel like you need to know how awesome he was so you can feel what a loss he was. So we're going to move forward a little bit, and in 1993, Matt's father, Dennis Shepard, was hired at Saudi Aramco, which was a Saudi Arabian oil company located in Durin, which was located in Saudi Arabia. Duh. So his family straight up moved to Saudi Arabia. Can you even imagine that? I can't even imagine moving out of the state that I live in, but to straight up go from Wyoming to Saudi Arabia? That's amazing. What? Matt's family thought that this move and this job would be a good opportunity for the whole family to just open their eyes to a new culture and to new people and to see the way other human beings live and to just kind of just bring some culture into all of their lives. And I think that that is just incredibly cool. And I wish that I had done that at some point in my life. Who knows? I'm still alive. Maybe one day. Probably not though, because that plane ride would be terrifying. While in Saudi Arabia, his family lived at the Saudi Aramco residential camp, which was basically just like a place that had been built so that employees of the company that he was working for would have a place to live while they were in this new country. And while there, Matt ended up attending a boarding school in Switzerland to finish off his high school career. Is it a career? Curriculum. To finish high school, because at the time there wasn't an American high school in Saudi Arabia, so off he jetted to Switzerland. And while there, he did great. He made a lot of friends while at this school in Switzerland, and of course he learned all about new cultures because he had America under his belt, he had Saudi Arabia under his belt, now he has Switzerland under his belt, and he just became a more worldly gentleman. Matt took theater classes while there. He also took classes on other languages like German and Italian, and he just did really well, and he ended up graduating from this high school in May of 1995. That same year in 1995, something absolutely horrible ended up happening to Matt. Well, it's just so sad. He was on a school trip to Morocco. Apparently the school provided, you could go on trips to other places. Field trips, if you will, and him and his friends chose Morocco. And while he was there, he ended up being raped by a group of men. Apparently, he was just out walking around. When he walked by an alley, these men grabbed him, they pulled him into the alley, and just completely brutalized him. And this experience traumatized him, and he was not himself after that. The night that it happened, Matt showed up at his friend's hotel room, the friend who had been in Morocco with him. He was shirtless, he had no shoes, and he was just screaming. His friend described it as just a scream that she had never heard before, and the two held each other and fell to the ground and just cried. When he came back from this trip to Morocco, he was just empty, he was a watered down version of himself. I can't even imagine what something like that would do to a person. He must have just been so scared. And once he came home, it was like the light inside him had dimmed. Where before he loved people, he was super social. Now he was super nervous around people. He was scared, and he just retreated into himself. So once Matt was back in the States, his family stayed in Saudi Arabia. He came back to the States. It was clear that he was suffering from pretty horrible depression and probably a little PTSD. And it was theorized that he might have even turned to drugs to try to kind of deal with what he was suffering from. Matt even ended up spending a little time in a hospital due to his depression and a worry that he may try to take his own life. It was just a really hard time for him. He was moving around a lot. He spent some time in Denver, Colorado. I think he was just trying to heal and trying to find his place in the world where he felt safe and he felt home. So Matt finally ended up calling home Laramie, Wyoming, which was where he had already lived in the first place. This is where he had grown up. And it was while there that he attended college. And it was while in college that he finally came out to his family. And his family was just as wonderful as a family could be. He had nothing to fear with his family. His family just made him feel very loved and accepted and just let him know that this was not a big deal. Because just in case any of you are wondering, someone else's sexuality should not be a big deal to you because it does not affect you whatsoever. They're gay. You're not. The end. So he started off his adult life and his college life just better, lighter, open. In school, he majored in political science and he minored in languages, and he did super well, and he started really thriving. He was doing well in school. He had even suggested making a mentoring program in school where some of the older students could help the newer students get their footing, particularly if they were gay. And he was just starting to come out to more of his close friends and started to feel more like himself again. He was just finally feeling happy and feeling safe, dude. And it's so, oh my God, so heartbreaking because literally just a week before he was killed, he told his friend / guidance counselor that he was finally feeling safe again. It was while living back in Laramie, Wyoming, the place that he called home, the place that he called safe, that he would be murdered. It was a cold night on October 6, 1998, and Matt was having a couple of drinks at the Fireside Lounge. So this was a bar that Matt came to from time to time. It wasn't unusual for the bartender there to see Matt just chilling, not killing, having a couple drinks, doing his thing. So he had asked some friends to join him that night, but they weren't really interested in going and having any drinks. So he was just there by himself, having a good time, trying to relax, trying to unwind from the day that he had had. After Matt had been there a couple of hours, he was approached by two men who were in their early 20s. These men had been hanging out in the bar also, sharing a pitcher of beer that they had paid for with coins, change, because they had no money. These men were Aaron McKinney and Russell Henderson. These two men were not unknown to police around the area. Aaron McKinney was known to police as just being kind of a piece of shit. They'd had many run-ins with him for stealing and fighting, dumb stuff like that. And his friend Russell Henderson was just known to be sort of like Aaron's lackey. And he just kind of did whatever Aaron did or whatever Aaron wanted. So these two absolute losers see Matt and they see that he has money and they see that he is gay and they're like, hey, I like money. Let's rob him. So they go up to Matt and they pretend to be gay and they hang out with him and they flirt with him a little bit. And they fucking assholes. And so they hang out with him until Matt's ready to leave. And when Matt's ready to leave, since he was walking, they offered him a ride home. So at about 11 p.m., Matt left with these two men. And this is the last time that he was seen alive by anyone but these men again. Once Matt was in the car with these men, he quickly found that he was in trouble, but he was trapped and there was nothing he could do. And I can't even imagine how scary that must have been for him, especially considering what happened to him in Morocco, the flashbacks he must have been having, and just imagining what was going to happen to him. It breaks my heart to think how scared he must have been in that moment. While Russell Henderson drove Aaron's truck, Aaron proceeded to beat Matt while in the truck and rob him. He's told Matt, like, give me your wallet, which Matt gave him right away. He was like, here, take it. Like, my life is worth more than this money. But clearly, based on what happens, it wasn't only money that these men were interested in. So they drive to a really deserted rural area on a dead-end road. And when they get there, they force him out of the truck and he tried to run and they kept dragging him back. And this can be seen at the crime scene because there's drag marks from when they dragged him back. So when they got him out of the car, they tied his hands behind his back and then they tied him to a fence that was next to the road. This is when Aaron proceeded to beat Matt in the head over and over with the butt of the gun that they had used to rob him. Apparently, Russell didn't hit him at all, but he stood by and he watched and enjoyed himself. All the while, Matt begged and pleaded and cried for his life, but this asshole just kept on beating him. He beat him nearly 20 times in the skull with the butt of a gun, and once they were satisfied that they had finished the job, they took the shoes off of Matt and then left him alone in the freezing cold October night to die. So while Matt is left there alone, freezing, bleeding, arms tied behind his back and then tied to a fence like he could do nothing, these men drive back into town because they had gotten Matt to give them his address and they intended to go to his house and rob him because they're dicks. On their way to Matt's house, it appears that Aaron still had a lot of rage in him, and it seems like he just kind of has an issue with anyone who's different than him because he ended up picking a fight with two Latino teenagers simply because they were Latino, and he fought them. The four of them ended up in a fight, Russell, Aaron, and the two teenagers, and it left these kids needing stitches in their head. I say kids, I'm pretty sure they were of age, but they were teenagers, and they needed stitches in their head after this fight. Apparently during this fight, one of these guys were scrappy and had gotten a good hit in on Russell. So Russell ended up actually having to go to the hospital because he had a wound also. Anyway, Russell ended up needing to go to the hospital, and it turns out that Russell and this Latino gentleman who needed stitches in his head were in the same hospital at the exact same time and didn't even realize it. I just think that that's kind of wild. But either way, these guys are really lucky, and they probably didn't even realize how lucky they were at the time that they weren't hurt more, considering what happened to Matt. Just like right before this fight, too. It's ugh. So Matt was discovered 18 hours after he had been attacked on October 7th, 1998, and he was found by a young man named Aaron who had just been out riding his bike, minding his own damn business when he came upon this just fucked up scene. Apparently, initially, Aaron actually thought that Matt was a, scarecrow because he was so beaten and unrecognizable. Plus, it was October and Halloween's coming up, so he just thought it was something totally different. Because what else would you think, right? He's tied to a fence. You're just out on an evening ride, trying to relax, and this is what you come upon. What are you going to think it is? So, though he thought it was a scarecrow, he thought it was, a pretty intense scarecrow, so he moved closer to it. And this is when he found that it was not a scarecrow, but the badly beaten body of Matthew Shepard. And Matt was still alive. He was barely breathing. And that must have just been such a horrific sight. Apparently he was completely covered in blood, and the only place on his face that was void of blood was 2 lines down his cheeks from where his tears had washed away the blood from him crying. So obviously police were called, and the very first officer who arrived on scene was not at all prepared for what she showed up for, because she was just told, dispatched to somebody who had been beaten, but she had no idea that it was going to be quite as intense as it was. So when she got there, she was like, oh shit, and she went closer to examine Matt, and this is when she saw that he was horribly beaten, but he was still alive, and she's like, oh, I need to try to save this boy, and she said that she couldn't tell at all what he looked like, that he just looked deformed. So when she was about to try to help Matt, she went to go put on her gloves, and she found that the gloves were faulty, and she was like, you know what? Oh, well, she didn't... Oh, this woman. She literally used her bare hands with no gloves and tried to clear a pathway in his throat so that he could breathe. She had cuts on her hands. She knew that she could be contaminated. This was a random person's blood, and she did not care. All she cared about was trying to save Matt's life. So Matt was taken to one hospital, but it was quickly found that his injuries were too extensive for them to handle. So Matt ended up being transferred to the advanced trauma unit at a hospital in Colorado now. The hospital's name, I do not know how to pronounce. I Googled it, and what I got seems wrong. It says that it's Poudre. P-O-U-D-R-E, but I don't know. That seems wrong. Poudre? Poudre. Anyway, a hospital in Colorado with an advanced trauma unit that could help Matt in the state that he was in. There it was discovered that Matt had fractures to the back of his head and in the front of his ear. The beating was so bad that it had severed his brainstem, which made it difficult for his body to control his bodily functions. And his condition was so bad that doctors said that at this point they really couldn't do anything except try to make him more comfortable. Okay, so back to the assholes that did this. So, Russell had been at the hospital, and now he has been discharged, and the 2 guys go over to the home where their girlfriends were. Aaron's girlfriend was Kristen Leanne Price. She was 19 years old and the mother of Aaron's 1 child. Yes, this asshole was a father. Russell Henderson's girlfriend was a 20-year-old girl named Chastity Vera Paisley. When the men arrived, they tell the girls what happened, and they said that they were pretty sure that they had, and I quote, killed a... Because at this point, these dickbags had thought that they had actually succeeded in killing Matt. So these girls were like, okay, cool. I'll help you dispose of evidence and come up with an alibi, no problem. Because these men at this point fully expected to get arrested. They knew they weren't getting away with this. Which they were right, they did get arrested. They were arrested while Matt lay in the hospital on life support. Once they were arrested, the police searched the truck that they had been driving that night, and that's where they found a whole bunch of evidence. They found the bloody gun they had used. They found Matt's stolen shoes. They found his wallet, his debit card, his ID, all of that jazz. So once they were arrested, they pretty quickly realized that they were screwed and just confessed to everything. Aaron said that he couldn't help himself, that he just blacked out and went crazy and just started beating the crap out of Matt. Beat him while he cried and he screamed and he begged for his life. Beat him until he was brain dead, all while Russell Henderson just stood by and laughed. Aaron said that he also forced Matt to tell him his address, because remember, they wanted to go rob him. And he also did this thing that must have been so horrifying. He told Matt, hey, look at my license plate and read it to me. And once Matt did that, he had confirmed what he already knew in his mind, that Matt knew the license plate number, that Matt could recite it to police so they could be identified, and so Matt had to die. So, while this is all happening, remember, Matt's parents are in Saudi Arabia, dude. So they receive a call at 5 a.m. their time, and they assume that it's going to be Matt because Matt was known to call them early, but they were surprised to find that it was actually a doctor at a hospital telling them that their son had been in some sort of accident and that they needed to get home immediately. And when his mom was like, what's going on? Is he okay? Is he going to survive? They just said, you need to get here. And I cannot even imagine what that phone call must have been like, because to get a call like that has got to be so devastating, because you are so far away. Your oldest son is hurt. You have no idea what's happened to him. You have no idea if he's even going to still be alive once you get there, because that flight has got to be so long. And And man, these poor people, once they got to America, they learned what had actually happened to their son from a family member who told them that Matt had been beaten into a coma, and that it was like national news, that it was everywhere, and that there was just coverage nonstop on what happened to him. And they were blown away because they hadn't seen any coverage, because they weren't covering this in Saudi Arabia. So they come home and find out that their son's been beaten, and it's like this famous case and everyone knows about it, and they had no idea. And speaking of the news coverage, so Matt had this friend. It was his friend and his guidance counselor. His name was Walt, and this is somebody who was very, very important to Matt in Matt's life. He was actually the first person that Matt ever came out to. Walt was also gay. Did I say that? I don't know if I did. Walt was gay. Matt looked up to him, confided in him. He was a very important person to Matt. So Walt was really concerned that the media was going to portray this as just a horrible mugging, like just a mugging that went wrong and glossed over it and blah-de-da-de-da, nothing to look at here. Don't look over here. And so he started calling around trying to figure out what he could do. And he wanted to ensure that this wasn't reported as just a mugging, because he knew that if all these guys wanted to do was rob Matt for the $20 he had on him, because that's all he had was $20, they wouldn't have driven him out into the middle of nowhere and literally beat him with a gun until he was brain dead. That doesn't make any sense. That's not what? So he took steps to ensure that it wasn't just local news, but national news, and that it was reported as the hate crime that it was. And what he did ended up actually working, and there was coverage on Matt's case all over the country, and all over the country people stood and held a candlelight vigil just waiting to see if Matt would pull through. So Matt's parents arrive at the hospital, and that's when they finally see just how badly he had been beaten. They said that they did not even recognize him at first until they got closer to him and they saw certain markings and certain scars, that you get growing up, identifiable features, and of course the braces on his teeth that he had worn since he was 13 and he was still wearing when he was beaten. So his family learns that, he's in a coma, and that if he survives, because it's possible that he would live, that he would only live in a vegetative state. He wasn't coming back from this. He was never going to be mad again. Oh, that one got me. So his family then had to make the difficult decision of whether or not they wanted to let him try to live like that or to take him off of life support, which just seems like such an impossible decision to make. This part's going to break your heart. It's breaking my heart already. So at one point, his dad, so desperate to try to get Matt to come back, he got in the car at 11 o'clock at night, and he made the 4-hour drive all the way back home to a storage unit that they had. And he parked at the storage unit and had his headlights flooding light in, and just started pulling everything out, trying to find some items that belonged to Matt so that he could bring them back to the hospital, and maybe Matt would sense them and come back. That's too much for my heart to handle. BRB. Ooh, he said that he was really trying to find Oscar. You remember in the beginning, Oscar, the little bunny he would carry around as a kid? And he said no matter how hard he searched, he couldn't find Oscar, and he was taking that as a sign from the universe that he needed to hold on to Oscar for himself. So when it comes to taking Matt off of life support, his family didn't have to end up making this decision because, luckily or unluckily, depending how you look at it, Matt did end up succumbing to his injuries and was pronounced dead 6 days after the attack at 12:53 a.m. on October 12th, 1998, just 2 months before his 22nd birthday. Apparently, that very same day, Matt's family had asked his friend and guidance counselor, remember Walt? I told you about Walt. Well, they had asked Walt if he would, go in the room and talk to Matt, because they couldn't bring themselves to do it, and tell him, to let go, that it was okay if he let go, that his family would understand, that everything was fine, and he did just that. A couple hours later, he let go, and that's when he died, and he died holding his mother and his brother's hands. After Matt died, his family released a statement. I believe the statement came from his mother directly, that their attorney read to the media, and it said, and I quote, "Please tell everyone who's listening to go home and to give their kids a hug, and don't let a day go by without telling them that you love them." And as their attorney read this, he had trouble keeping it together. I watched it, and he was just breaking, as I imagine one would. His poor family, dude. I don't know how they kept it together, and they were clearly wrecked. You can see it. You watch interviews with them in the beginning, and his mom can barely hold herself up, and his dad just seems very stoic, like he's trying very hard to keep it together. His dad said in an interview in this documentary I watched, which I'm going to talk more about this documentary at the end because you guys should really watch it, but in this documentary he said that after Matt died, he sat and he wrote this list, oh my god, of things that he loved about Matt and that he would miss about Matt and that he wanted to remember. Because, you just forget things as you get older. And this seems like a very sweet thing to do, but it also seems impossibly sad. I can't imagine doing that. So yeah, he would just read that list over and over to remember Matt. In another interview his dad gave, this one wasn't in the documentary, but I was just looking up interviews with his family on YouTube, as one does. He had this to say about losing his son, and this is a quote, and this is, again, very heartbreaking. "When you have a closet filled with games for 4, and you have to start giving those away because you no longer have 4, and you have your Mother's Day calls and Father's Day calls and cards you don't get, and you have the Christmas and the birthday, that's when it starts to hit." So as I said before, these dicks that did this to Matt were already arrested, and initially, since Matt was still alive, the charges that they have were less, but once Matt died, they were changed to first-degree murder, and they were eligible for the death penalty. And that reminds me so much of the Sophie Lancaster case. If you haven't seen it, you should definitely watch it. It's another really sad hate crime, but she too was beaten and was put into a coma, and once she died, the charges went up, and it just made me immediately think about that case. It's so sad. Anyway. Matthew's mother, which, this woman, so strong woman, well, she was against these men being put to death. She said something along the lines of the pain and the hate needs to stop now. The death needs to stop now. And she convinced her husband that they should not go after the death penalty. And initially Matt's dad was all for it. He wanted them to fry. But she was able to convince him that they should try to take the death penalty out of the equation. I don't know if I could be so noble. I don't know if I could. Matt's funeral was insane. There were so many people there that they ended up having to open up more space across the street for the guests, because there were just so many people there who felt for Matt, felt for his family, people he didn't even know, just people who felt personally affected by what had happened. It wasn't only people who loved Matt and supported Matt who showed up at his funeral, and this is gonna make you mad. Well, the Westboro Baptist Church showed up, and they showed up carrying signs that said things like, and I'm sorry, but God hates. They showed up to his funeral and started yelling things at the attendees, at his family, at his friends, like that Matt deserved what happened to him because he was gay. Can you imagine how Matt's parents felt To lose your 21-year-old son to a random act of violence like this that was so brutal, completely unprovoked. They beat him to death. That's just for no reason. And then to have these dick bags show up and yell at you that your son deserved it. That makes me fucking crazy. Anyway, his friends, in response to try to protect the family, ended up linking arms and making a chain to put themselves between the family and the protesters to try to protect them from these attacks. And I'm sure you've actually seen the photos of the protest outside Matt's funeral because they've been on the internet for years. And they're horrible. You see kids holding signs, just everyone holding signs, and they're all just so stupid. If you Google the protest, you'll be like, oh yeah, I've definitely seen those because they've been around for a long time. Oh, I just thought of something that I forgot to mention, so we can call this like a fun fact. I mean, it's not really a fun fact, it's just like additional information. But Aaron and Russell's girlfriends, Kristen Price and Chastity Paisley, well, they both got arrested as well because, they were helping cover up a murder, destroying evidence, making false statements, things like that. And they ended up telling police that their boyfriends were stone cold sober when they committed the crime, just so that if the guys tried to be like, oh, we were drunk, we were crazy, they couldn't say that. So now we're moving to April of 1999, where Russell Henderson was able to avoid going to trial by taking a plea deal to avoid the death penalty. He agreed to testify against Aaron at trial and pled guilty to the kidnapping and murder charges. He was given 2 consecutive life sentences, and his defense attorney was adamant that this was not a hate crime and that they did not target Matt because he was gay. Aaron McKinney's trial started in October of 1999, and he was facing charges of kidnapping, robbery, and murder. Initially, his defense attorney tried to use the gay panic defense. They said that Aaron went into a fit of insanity when Matt tried to put his hand on Aaron's leg while they were driving together in the truck, which, I'm sorry, didn't you men pretend to be gay to get him into the truck in the first place? That makes no fucking sense. And the judge seemed to agree with me there, because the judge was like, I don't think so, bud. So the defense instead tried to say, okay, yeah, we did kill him, but it wasn't premeditated, okay? We didn't intend to kill him. All we wanted to do was rob him and beat him, which it's like, but you beat him 20 times in the head to the point that you fractured his skull and severed his brainstem. But okay, anyway, the prosecution obviously disagreed. They said that this was clearly a premeditated crime and that it was fueled by greed and violence. And what I found interesting in this trial is that neither the defense or the prosecution really tried to bring the fact that Matt's sexual orientation was a contributing factor into the trial. Not even the prosecution tried to make it seem like a hate crime. And I couldn't really find out why that was, but I found it to be interesting. If you know why that wasn't really brought up in the trial, please let me know, because I am very curious, since that's very clearly what it was, and what this case is known for. In the end, the jury found McKinney not guilty of premeditated murder, but guilty of felony murder, and because of that, the death penalty was on the table. As I said before, Matt's parents did not want to put these two to death. Well, maybe they wanted it deep down, but they didn't want to pursue it. So he ended up making a deal where he pled guilty and he ended up getting 2 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole. After this verdict was delivered, Matt's father made a statement to Aaron McKinney, and this is the statement, and I quote here. Ooh. Mr. McKinney, I'm going to grant you your life, as hard as that is for me to do, for Matthew. Every time you celebrate Christmas or a birthday or 4th of July, remember that Matt isn't. Mr. McKinney, I give you your life in the memory of the one who no longer lives. May you have a long life and thank Matthew every day for it. Initially, Matt's ashes were, because he was cremated, and his ashes were kept with his family because they were worried if they gave him a final resting place, some dickheads would vandalize it. But in 2018, just over 20 years after Matt's murder, his ashes were secured at the Washington National Cathedral. Judy and Dennis, Matt's parents, man, they really did everything they could and rallied and tried and pushed to try to make change in the name of their lost son. Judy has said that she knew that she could have just left the spotlight and went and hid forever, laid down, been done with it all. But she knew that she only had a small window of time where she could really change something and use the publicity and the platform her family had for the greater good. And they're doing, in Matt's name, exactly what Matt wanted to do with his life. They're advocating for change and for gay rights and helping marginalized people. And they created the Matthew Shepard Foundation just to help them do all of that. And I think that that's just such an amazing thing. Anytime people can take their grief and turn it into something that helps other people, that blows my mind, because I don't think I would be so strong. Matt's mother, Judy, has said that she believes that Matt's greatest legacy is his generation of advocates, which I just think is like, it hits you right here. Matt's father has also said of his son's legacy, and I quote, "You look back at it now, and maybe it was meant to be." His goal was to help change the world. And the way he helped change the world is not really the way I would have wanted him to have changed it, but it happened. Again, my heart. This case had such a wide reach that the ripple effect from his death was pretty intense. In 2004, there was a 2020 episode on Matt's case. Celebrities like Bill Clinton and Ellen DeGeneres came out and spoke about Matt and about how his death had affected them and had affected just people in general. And in 2009, Obama signed the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act, and this law made it a federal crime to assault someone based on their sexuality or gender identity. And don't worry, we're going to cover the James Byrd Jr. case in the future. It's just it's a really intense one. It's going to come eventually. Let me know if you want to see it sooner rather than later. It's horrible. Because of what happened to Matt, a friend of his named Romaine, who is an American LGBTQIA activist, created a counter-protest group that is called Angel Action. And basically what they do is they show up at the funerals and places where they know there are going to be protests, and they come dressed up as angels with these giant wings, and they create a barricade between the people who are being harassed and the protesters to protect them, which I think is really sweet, and I believe they are actually still doing it to this day. As a response to Matt's murder, the Laramie Project was also invented. It's a play that was written that basically depicts the entire crime. It shows what happened to Matt. It shows the community's reaction to what happened to Matt and how people were affected, and this is a play that has been performed on stages nationwide. And I guess this one would kind of be considered a fun fact, if you will. There's this TV show, it's called 6 Feet Under, which if you have not seen it, highly suggest. I love it. It's one of my all-time favorite shows. I have a 6 Feet Under tattoo on my leg. Well, one of the episodes, it's funny, it's season 1, episode 12. And wait, real quick, backtrack. Every episode of 6 Feet Under opens with a death, like somebody dies, and then the episode progresses from there. And season 1, episode 12, the death scene in the beginning of it, I was thinking about it, and it reminded me a lot of Matt Shepard. It's obviously different, but something about the way the casting of the men in the beginning of it and what happened in this opening scene made me think of Matt's case. And so when I was looking into this case, I actually ended up Googling that episode because I was like, I wonder, because just, man, the casting and all that. So when I looked into it, it turns out that that episode was actually inspired by Matt's murder. I guess when season 1 of 6 Feet Under was being written, Matt's death was still very fresh, so the people who were writing were affected by it. And in that episode, so there's a character on the show named David who is gay, and after this character that's supposed to be like Matt is killed, his spirit keeps showing up and talking to David who is gay and trying to get him to come out of the closet and be more open and accept who he is. And I just found that to be an interesting fun fact since I like that show so much. And I had never really considered that it was inspired by Matt's case until I started really looking into it and then started to really think about it. So I thought I'd share that information with you. Now, the documentary I watched in preparation for this case, it's called Matt Shepard is a Friend of Mine, and it was created by one of his close friends. Her name is Michelle. In the opening scene of this documentary, she reads a letter that Matt had written to her. Because you remember in high school when you would like write letters to each other in class, and then like between classes you would exchange letters, read them, write back. Well, he had written her a letter, and she was reading it, and it basically is Matt describing himself to her in his own words, and I wanted to read that for you. Okay. I am funny, sometimes forgetful, and messy, and lazy. I'm not a lazy person, though. I'm giving and understanding and formal and polite. I'm sensitive, I'm honest, I am sincere. I'm not a pest. I am my own person. I am warm, I love helping, I love smiling. I love being myself. I love learning, I love eating. I love airports, I love hugs. So you can watch this documentary for free on Tubi if you have that app on your phone. I've mentioned it before. They have some good true crime stuff on there. And you can also rent it on YouTube, I believe, for like $4. But I would suggest watching it if you want to learn more about this case. It's very valuable to see these people who knew Matt well actually talk about him, and to see like the home movies. And I immediately start to cry when I think about the home movies, because you just see him playing with his little brother who loved him so much. And it's incredibly humanizing when you watch home videos and see the people who actually knew the person who died talk about the person and who they were to them, and not just their murder. And I think that that's important to humanize these people, because they did exist, they lived, they loved, and they were loved by people, and now they're gone. And I think it's important for us to remember that these aren't just stories, these are people's lives that were actually ended. And you know, his absence is felt strongly by those who did love him. So, and I feel like to watch that documentary, you'll love him too. And with any luck, you'll feel his absence too, which I think is valuable. And that, my friends, is the story of the brutal murder of Matt Shepard, one of the most notorious anti-gay hate crimes in American history. What did you think? Honestly, I'm surprised I kept it together as well as I did. I'm sure I've mentioned before, but these types of cases really get to me for some reason. They hit a little different. I don't know what it is. And it's just so horrible for me to imagine the people who loved him not only losing him, but losing him like that. And then to have to know all the details of what happened to him, all the stuff I just told you, like anyone who's ever known him and ever loved him can look into this case and know that all of that happened. And I can't even imagine how scared he must have been. And I don't understand people like that, dude. People who do things like this. Why? I just don't understand how any person could ever hate somebody that much. They didn't even know him. They had no idea who it was that they were killing. All they did was look over at him and saw that he was gay and killed him for it. And for what, $20? That's so upsetting. And then, for these dick bags to come from that church and protest his funeral and scream at his parents and hold the signs with the profanities. What the fuck? Like, why? Who are you? Why would you ever do something like that? So this is supposed to be from a church? This is what you do in the name of God? Get fucked. Honestly, anyone who would ever do something like that can get fucked. And that's that on that. But anyways, guys, that completes this video. I hope that you found it interesting and informative, and that you took something positive away from it, or just took something away from this. And of course, I want to thank you for hanging out and remembering Matt with me today. He was so worth remembering. You know, I could say a million things. I could say a million insults about the monsters who killed him, and a million positive things about who Matt was as a person. But I think his mom said it best when she said that his greatest legacy is the generation of advocates who followed him. So be an advocate, be vocal about things that matter and people you care about, and, you know, tell Matt's story and the stories of people like Matt, because it's important, because you might be able to change someone's mind. Sometimes it takes something horrible like this happening before people realize that horrible things like this actually happen, and it can change people's perspectives. And if you can change and they can change, anybody can change, you know? My name is Brittany, or Bratterstein, whichever you prefer, and today we're going to be discussing the horrible murder of a young man named Charlie Howard. Now, that name might not sound familiar to you. But if you saw the 2019 adaptation of It Chapter 2, then you have already seen Charlie Howard's murder dramatized on film in the opening scene of It Chapter 2 through the character of Adrian Mellon. And didn't even realize that what you were watching was actually something that really happened. So now that I'm done basically begging you to be my friend, we can get into this case. Now, I came upon the story of Charlie Howard and his murder because, like many people in the world, I saw the remake of Stephen King's It. I was very big fan of the original, saw the remake, and in this reimagination, they had 2 parts. It Chapter 1, Chapter 2. So I went in to see Chapter 2, and I left that theater very affected by the opening scene of the movie. If you don't remember, in the opening scene, a gay man is attacked and brutalized just simply for being gay. And for some reason, something about that scene stuck out to me. It didn't really feel like it flowed with the rest of the movie. It felt needlessly aggressive and intense. And when I left, I was like, damn, that felt so brutal. And it felt so real that maybe it was. So I got on the Google machine and I looked it up, and it turns out that it's because it was real. Charlie Howard was murdered in Bangor, Maine in 1984. And at the time that this happened, Stephen King was actually living in Bangor, Maine. He was in his mid-30s with his wife and his kids. And he was in the middle of writing It when Charlie Howard was murdered in his town. So King found himself moved by Charlie's death, just like a lot of people in that area did at the time. And so he added what happened to Charlie into his book, because in the book of It, it's supposed to take place in a place, Derry, where terrible, terrible things happen. So it just kind of made sense that Charlie would be added to that, because what happened to Charlie was just that terrible. So once I decided that I wanted to make a video on Charlie's case, I decided to go on YouTube and see how many videos there already were. I just kind of like to see if it's going to be an oversaturated story. I was still going to do it regardless because I felt personally connected to it. But when I looked, I was shocked to find there are like no videos on Charlie's case. There was maybe like 1 on YouTube. And that blew my mind because it was so brutal and so intense and so important in Bangor, Maine when it happened. And so much has happened since then because of it that it kind of blew my mind that it's not discussed more, because what happened to Charlie was so horrible and he deserves to be remembered and to have his story told. So I'm going to tell you that story today. And while I tell you the story, I'm going to put on a full face of makeup. Now, if that's not your thing, feel free to click off. Thank you for waiting this long. But if you're kind of on the fence and you're like, that sounds odd, I'm not sure, maybe stick around. You might be surprised by how much you like it. So come, gather around and let me tell you the story of the tragic murder of Charlie Howard, the inspiration for the gay bashing murder scene in Stephen King's It. Charlie Howard was born Charles O. Howard on January 31st, 1961, making him an Aquarius, and he was born in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. As Charlie grew up, he was a small boy in stature with a head of blonde hair, and all of this lasted into his young adulthood. As a child, he was often picked on and bullied for a couple of reasons. 1, his small size. 2, he was just an overall sickly boy. He suffered from pretty bad asthma, and he didn't really know how to swim. So when his school would take trips to the lake, Charlie would typically sit on the sidelines and watch the others have fun. And 3, he knew from a super young age that he was gay. And as we know, it was not something that was common or accepted back then. And I mean, in some places, it's still not super accepted because people are worms. But Charlie, he knew who he was and he was unapologetic about it, as one should be. He would wear whatever he wanted. He would wear heels and a purse and not give up what anybody thought about that. He was really into drawing like women's fashion, and a lot of his friends thought that he would grow up to be a fashion designer. So though I think that Charlie being his most authentic self is an obvious positive, it's not always the easiest choice to make. There are always going to be people who are going to give you shit about it. There's always going to be people who are going to hate you for being different than they are. And especially in high school, man, kids are such dicks. So Charlie got a lot of ridicule from his peers, and he actually ended up not even walking at his graduation because he didn't want his family to see how mean the other kids were to him, which is really sad. One of Charlie's teachers growing up had this to say about Charlie and who he was as a person. He was a small, handsome, blonde young man. He was very caring and never angry. He had a lot of potential. He was a risk taker and a pioneer. He never even went to his own prom or graduation because his family feared for his safety. His grave has no marker for fear of reprisals at that time. I believe that had he lived, he would be a prominent advocate and leader. What a shame that was never possible. After graduating high school, Charlie decided that college wasn't really for him. He wasn't a particularly strong academic, and he had had some challenges in learning in school. He wasn't just like, some people's school is just not for them. You know what I mean? It just isn't. So he decided that instead he wanted to up and move his life to a new place with new people, new experiences where nobody knew his name. Bum, 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 bum. He ended up first landing in a place called Ellsworth, Maine, which was about a 3-hour drive from his hometown. And while he was there, he had a boyfriend and he did pretty well. But once that relationship ended, he decided he wanted to move again. So he packed up, and this time he headed to Bangor, Maine, which was about a 35-minute drive away. Things didn't go super well for Charlie once he ended up in Bangor, though. Like, I don't know exactly what was going on with him, but he had a lot of trouble finding work. And because of this and having no job and no money, he actually ended up homeless while he was in Bangor. 2 men named Paul and Scott who lived in Bangor. I'm not sure if they were just friends and like roommates or if they were boyfriends. Well, either way, they became friends with Charlie. They befriended him and they actually let him move in with them to kind of give him, just a chance out there, get him off the street, help him try to find a job, get things better, improve his life in any way that they could help. After about a month of Charlie living with Paul and Scott, things didn't really seem to be going any better. Charlie still wasn't able to find work. He was still struggling. So Paul and Scott were like, listen, maybe this just isn't the best place for you. And they actually convinced Charlie to move back with his family in New Hampshire. And this seemed like it was going to be a good thing for him when he got back home, because he listened to them and he went back home. But this did not last. He was only back at home with his family for about a week when he realized this was not for him. This wasn't a good fit. He remembered why he left in the first place and he just wanted to leave. So he called his friends back up and he's like, listen, I can't do this. And they heard in his voice how much he was mentally suffering. So they were like, fine, you know what? Just come back and you can stay with us again. And so he went back again to Bangor. He was just trying to find his place in the world, man. So Charlie went back to Bangor, and at first, just like before, he was living with Paul and Scott, but things seemed to be different this time around, and he seemed to be, something mentally had shifted with him, and he seemed to be able to get himself together, get on his own 2 feet, and try to make a better life for himself instead of kind of wallowing in all of his perceived failures. He joined a local church. Back then it was called the Unitarian Church, but now it's known as the Brick Church. And at the time, this was one of the few places in the 80s where the LGBTQIA community could feel safe and open, just being themselves in a place, just accepted, in a church. Charlie also joined a local gay rights group that was called Interweave. And at this place, he was actually able to make some new friends and find people who not only accepted him for who he was, but embraced him for who he was and celebrated him for who he was. And he was making friends and he was just doing so well, man. He had all these new people in his life. He had a church that accepted him. He was starting to love himself. And this was just 6 months before he would be murdered. Charlie just seemed like a really nice guy. When I read about him, I was just like, oh, he seemed like a sweetheart. The Easter that he was staying with Paul and Scott, he decided he wanted to surprise them. So while they were out of the house, he decorated their entire apartment and some cute little Easter decorations and then made them a nice dinner because he was so appreciative of them for letting him come back and stay with them and help him get back on his own 2 feet. And Charlie wasn't just standing on his own 2 feet, man. He was thriving. He was doing so well. He was happy. He was completely out of the closet. He was out of the closet back home, but now he was completely out of the closet here in Bangor, and he had all of his friends that made him feel more comfortable. He was completely, himself. He was open. He just seemed like he had found himself. He had found his people. He was able to completely be himself. He would wear makeup. He would go out and party. He was just doing the damn thing and living his best life. Charlie was doing so well that he was even able to move out of his friend's house. He got his own little apartment that was just down the street from his church, and he even got himself a little kitten. He just sounded like he was doing really well. And it's really sad that he didn't get to really see how good his life could be because he just started having a good life when all of this fucking horrible shit happened to him. people at that time, not all, but a lot, the majority of people at that time were not particularly tolerant of Charlie or any gay human beings for that matter. And that's putting it lightly. It's not that they weren't tolerant. They were straight up awful. And obviously I don't mean that everyone in this area at the time was horrible and homophobic, because someone's going to take what I say wrong, but the time was really different and there were more people like that, and it was more socially acceptable to be open about your distaste for someone just simply because they were gay, like it affects you in any way at all. Charlie would often get verbally harassed by people when he was just like walking out on the street, just out of nowhere for no reason. And he was the type of guy that instead of like getting pissy or getting mean, he would like turn to them, look at them, and blow them kisses in response, which I just think is fantastic. But even though Charlie had like a good mental attitude towards, you know, the people who would treat him so poorly, it got so much stupid shit happened. Like at one point he was even at a nightclub with one of his friends and he got kicked out. The people who worked there kicked him out of the nightclub because he was in there dancing with another guy, and they were like, absolutely not, you're not going to do that stuff here, which is just like stupid shit. But it went from just like stupid shit like that to dangerous stuff when one day he came home, and I'm just going to tell you this is a bummer, but that kitten that he got, the kitten that he had gotten when he got his new apartment, he found that kitten dead on his doorstep. Somebody had strangled it. I'm sorry. What? So Charlie knew, though he wasn't going to tone himself down, he at least needed to be careful because people were dangerous. As much as he wanted to just kind of be like, oh, everything's fine, some people out there were dangerous. And sadly, Charlie was going to get more of that, not less of that. Okay, so now we're going to get in our handy dandy time machine and we're going to head to Saturday, July 7th, 1984, the last day of Charlie's life. So Charlie had been attending a potluck at Interweave. You remember Interweave? It was that gay rights group that he had joined and he had made all those friends at. Well, after the potluck, he and a friend of his left together, a man named Roy, at about 10 p.m. On the way home, Charlie and Roy passed through a parking lot because Charlie wanted to pick up some of his mail, and once he had, the two started to head home. They had been walking and they were going up State Street when they came upon the Kenduskeag River Bridge, and this is when they noticed a car filled with 3 teenage boys and 2 teenage girls that began to slow down near them. These teenagers had apparently been party hopping that night, and they had just came from a party and had left to do a quick beer run. They were out driving around looking for someone with an ID to help them buy booze, and they just at this time happened upon Charlie and Roy. So talk about wrong place, wrong time. I hate that. It always is that, isn't it? And these boys decided to take this opportunity to be absolute pieces of human shit. This is when the driver of the car pulled the car over and 3 teenage boys jumped out of the car and they yelled to Charlie and Roy, "Hey, are you guys gay?" And this is when Charlie and Roy took off running and these boys started running after them, and the girls that were in the car stayed in the car. The 3 boys ended up catching up to Charlie because he started to experience an asthma attack. As I told you in the beginning, when he was younger, he had bad asthma. This continued into his adult life, so he started having an asthma attack, and he ended up tripping and falling to the ground, and this made it easier for these boys to catch him. And once they caught up to him, they started to just beat the crap out of him. They started punching him and kicking him while he lay on the ground, unable to breathe. And when this was happening, Roy was just hiding out of sight because honestly, like what could he do? I don't know. I don't know what he could do, and I don't know what I would do in that situation, but he was hiding out of sight while this was happening. Once these boys were done beating Charlie, they picked him up off the ground and they started leading him to the edge of the bridge that they were on. And this is when Charlie flipped out and started screaming and begging for his life, telling these boys that he didn't know how to swim. As they lifted him over the railing, he grabbed onto the edge and still was like, please don't do this. I cannot swim. And these dickheads pried his fingers off the railing and threw him over the edge after beating him into the water 15 feet below. The boys then ran back to the car where the girls were, and the girls started it up to take off, and this is when they noticed Roy, and they threatened him as they left not to tell anyone, not to do anything, or they would, do the same thing to him, and they drove off into the night, and this is when Roy was like, oh shit. And he took off running, trying to find a phone, because this is 1984, and there are no cell phones. So he finally did find a fire alarm on State Street, and he pulled the fire alarm to alert the ambulances and the police to come. Once the police arrived and Roy told them what had happened, a search immediately started to try to find Charlie, hoping that he was still alive, but I don't think anyone was feeling very positively about this, unfortunately. I don't see how anyone could. It took them a couple of hours of searching, but sadly, at about 12:30 a.m. on July 8th, 1984, Charlie's dead body was found floating in 3 feet of water. Upon doing Charlie's autopsy, it was found that when he went into the water, he suffered from a really bad asthma attack, and because he couldn't breathe and he couldn't swim, he drowned. So while this was happening, while police are searching this freaking river for Charlie's body, these assholes who threw him in the river went back to their party and bragged about what they did. They even referred to the Kenduskeag River Bridge as the, and I quote here, and it's not cool, as the Chuckahomo Bridge. Fucking assholes. The following day, the news of Charlie's murder hit the media, and this is when the boys realized that this man that they threw over had died as a result of it. And fortunately, one of them had an attack of conscience and ended up turning himself in. The girls who were in the car also went to the police and told them what happened, but the other boys freaked out when they found out that they were going to get into some trouble. So they actually decided that they were going to jump on a freight train. Never come back. But they ended up changing their mind, and they came home, and when they came back home, the police were waiting there to arrest them. These boys made their first court appearance on Monday, July 9th, 1984. This same night, 200 people stood outside the Bangor police station with candles to hold a vigil for Charlie. Charlie's memorial service was held at the church that he attended, that he had finally found his acceptance at. And after the funeral service, his friends and his family went to the bridge where he was murdered, and they threw flowers over the bridge for Charlie. And this is something that people still do every year to this day in remembrance of Charlie. So when these boys were asked why they did what they did, they said that a couple of days prior to the murders, they had encountered Charlie, and Charlie had made some sexual advances towards them. This is what they said. Though, just for the record, this was never proven, and I don't believe is true, especially since if that was the case, why would they pull over and yell, "Are you guys gay?" Like they would know. You know what I mean? Like, it's just stupid kids trying to figure out a way not to get in trouble for doing something fucking horrible. Initially, they also tried to use the gay panic defense, which don't even get me started on that. Don't even get me started on that. Anyway, this did not end up working because these kids had already told police, and this is a quote here, that they beat Charlie because they wanted to beat up and that they had already done this together before. The response from the majority of the community was disgusting and embarrassing for humanity, in my opinion. Instead of being in shock and being outraged, like, how could these boys, these freaking teenage boys, murder this man for no reason at all? They were more like, well, maybe Charlie should have made better attempts to hide the fact that he was gay, and then this wouldn't have happened to him. People also thought that these boys should be given leniency because boys will be boys. And they didn't mean to kill Charlie. The 3 murderers were all minors at the time that they killed Charlie, and they were Sean Mabry, who was 16 at the time, James Jim Baines, who was 15 years old, and Daniel Ness, who was 17 years old. All 3 boys were initially sent to Hancock County Jail, but all of them were released to their parents to await trial. I can't imagine how weird that must have been for their parents to, take them home and know that they're just waiting until they have to take them back to be tried for murder. That's freaking crazy. The prosecution in this case wanted these 3 boys to be tried as adults because they had committed a pretty adult crime, in his opinion, and I agree. Attorney General James Tierney wanted the public and these boys to take hate crimes like this seriously, and he thought that he'd be able to set a precedent with these boys and how these types of crimes would be responded to. He wanted these kids and the public to see, and I quote, that Charlie Howard had a mom and family and friends who were devastated at his loss, as any of us would be if we had had a loved one who was murdered. A hearing was held on Friday, September 18th, 1984, and this was for the judge to determine whether or not these boys would be tried as adults or minors. The medical examiner, police officers, witnesses, and psychological examiners were all called to testify at this hearing. After 2 days, the judge made his ruling, and he said of this decision, and I quote here, I find that the offense was committed in a violent and aggressive and willful manner. I find nothing on the record of this case that would indicate that any of the three have a previous history, record, emotional attitude, or pattern of living that would dictate that they should be treated as adults. So he said that what they did was horrible and willful and hateful and awful, but that they still should not be tried as adults. So, despite the prosecution's best efforts, not only were these boys going to be tried as minors instead of adults, but the charges were also changed from murder to manslaughter. And all of the boys pled guilty to manslaughter, and on October 1st, 1984, they were sentenced to the Maine Youth Center for an indeterminate stay, but it was not to exceed their 21st birthdays. So, no later than February 28th, 1988, and their records were to be sealed. And real quick, I would really like to know what you guys think about this, because I have a lot of feelings and a lot of thoughts, but they're definitely emotionally fueled. So being unbiased in this is a little bit challenging for me, if I'm very honest with you. Because on one hand, I do get that they are kids. 15 is pretty young. However, I think an appropriate punishment would be second-degree murder and them being tried as adults, because, man, what they did is just so effed up. And we have tried younger people as adults before. And what they did was so hateful and just awful. And I just want to know what you think about that. I just think manslaughter, no, I don't think so. And as minors, they should have, I don't know. It just seems really, really lenient. The judge, though he did not decide to try them as adults, did seem to see that there was broader implications to the murder of Charlie. And he said of this, and I quote, "Disappointment should be the feeling of everyone when it is recognized that with all that we have available in this great country, we still have prejudice. We still have ignorance and intolerance which serve as breeders for tragedies such as this. Disappointment that 3 young people can be so calloused regarding their real values in life that human life becomes secondary to thrill-seeking and pseudo-macho activity." And to that I say, and still we don't try them as adults? Of course, as I'm sure you can imagine, the people out there who really cared about Charlie personally and just this case in general, and the implications and the precedent that this sort of ruling made, were outraged, as I think they should have been. First, to charge them as minors. Then, to give them a plea deal so that they could get manslaughter instead of murder. It just lessens the severity of what they did and shows that, like, it didn't matter, in my opinion. Like, it didn't matter enough to give them a harsher punishment. And that's heartbreaking. James Jim Baines was released from prison after serving only 2 years. Okay? And Sean Mabry was released after only 22 months in jail. And there's nothing online to say how long that Daniel Ness served. Their records were sealed, so I'm lucky that I was even able to find out about the other 2 men. But I'm going to guess that it was something pretty close to the other 2. Charlie was buried in an unmarked grave in Orchard Grove Cemetery in Kittery, Maine. Apparently, 25 years after Charlie's murder, I believe it was for the anniversary, I could be wrong on that though, the Bangor Daily News actually tried to locate these three boys, well, men now, to get an interview with them and get their opinions on the case and just kind of see where they were mentally with that now that they were adults. They weren't able to locate Sean Mabry or Daniel Ness, but they did locate James Jim Baines, and he was open to talking with them. He was actually more than open. When they found him, he was still living in Bangor, and he was married and had a couple kids, and he at least seems like what happened, what he did changed him as a person and kind of opened his eyes to being a better person and a more open and accepting person. After being released as a young adult, he often went to local schools to discuss tolerance of all people. He addressed the Maine state legislature in support of a bill to ban discrimination based on sexual orientation. He also co-authored a book called Penitence alongside author Edward James Armstrong, which was a book about Charlie's murder, and he took part in it just to help. He didn't receive any profit from helping with the book, and he says that he really regrets what he did. And do with that information what you will. I have so much trouble seeing people like this as good people, even if they make positive changes with their life. But I am happy to see that he's trying to do something good with his life and something for the better. He was only 15 when this happened, so you change a lot from that time. And I'm glad to see that with his freedom, he's doing something good and not just sitting around being a hateful son of a bitch. So that's something. Sean Mabry was able to be located later, and he too says that he regrets what he did and regrets what happened to Charlie, and he says that he thinks about Charlie every single day. And in an interview in 1994, he said, and I quote, "Charlie Howard was so young. He was helpless that night, and three reckless kids come along and just for the hell of it toss him over the bridge. Because of our actions, Charlie Howard lost his life." In Bangor, Maine, July 7th, the day that Charlie died, is known as Diversity Day, and people go every year and throw flowers off the bridge in remembrance of Charlie. There was also a memorial erected in Charlie's honor in 2009 next to the place where he died. It's a big stone that has words engraved on it, and the words are, "May we, the citizens of Bangor, continue to change the world around us until hatred becomes peacemaking and ignorance becomes understanding." Some absolute assholes, dude. Oh my god, I'm so irritated. Some assholes actually went and vandalized this stone that was set up for Charlie. They spray painted graffiti all over it and wrote some choice words. I'm not going to say the words. I'm sure you can guess the words. But this happened in 2011. 2011, dude. May of 2011. So only 10 years ago now. After all this time that he had been gone, some people went there and vandalized his memorial. People still suck, dude. Like how? Why? Are you dumb? Are you a big dumb idiot? Fuck off. People who do things like that, fuck right the fuck off. The memorial was restored back to its original magic. I don't know the word I'm looking for. It was restored by people who actually cared about him, but I'm just saying, like, it was restored by people who cared about him. Sorry, I got a little heated there. But it just goes to show you this was only 10 years ago. So this is still a problem. This was a problem. It continues to be a problem. None of this happened that long ago. So there's still people out there who are hateful like this. And that's so disappointing. And now my dog's drinking water. So I'll just go fuck myself. So now we're going to fast forward a little bit, talk about Maine as a state and how they have actually taken, since this happened, a lot of steps to be more progressive in general, particularly when it comes to the LGBTQIA community. They have passed equal rights legislation, and they were actually the very first state in the country, I believe, to sign same-sex legislation into law without court action. And you know what's really dumb? The same year that Charlie's memorial stone was erected, this law ended up being overturned, okay, at the polls, because, of course, it's very frustrating. But Maine did again become the first state to legalize same-sex marriage in 2012. And Maine was the very first state to have an openly gay governor. So go Maine. Oh my God. A famous poet named Mark Doty, D-O-T-Y, however you pronounce that. Well, he wrote a poem either about Charlie or for Charlie. He was affected by Charlie's death, so he wrote this poem. And I'm going to read it to you. And I'm going to try to keep it together because it's incredibly just like, oh, right there, right there. Between the river and the bridge, he falls through. A huge portion of the night, it is not as if falling is something new. Over and over, he slipped into the gulf between what he knew and how he was known. What others wanted opened like an abyss. The laughing stock clerks at the grocery, women at the luncheonettes amused by his gestures. What could he do? Live with one hand tied behind his back? So he began to fall into the star-faced section of night, between the trestle and the water, because he could not meet a little town's demands. And his earrings shone, and his wrists were as limp as they were. I imagine he took the insults in and made of them a place to live. We learn to use the names because they are there. Familiar furniture. That was the bed he slept in. Hard and white, but simple somehow. Queer, something sharp, but finally useful. A tool. All the jokes a chair. Stiff-backed to keep the spine straight. A table, a lamp. And because he's fallen for 23 years, despite whatever awkwardness his flailing arms and legs assume, he is beautiful. And like any good diver has only an edge of fear, he transforms into grace. Or else he is not afraid, and in this way he climbs back up the ladder of his fall. Out of the river and into the arms of the 3 teenage boys who hurled him over the edge. Really boys now, afraid. Their father's cars now shivering behind them. Headlights on. And tells them it's all right. That he knows they didn't believe him when he told them he couldn't swim. And blesses his killers in the way that only the dead can afford to forgive. And that, my friends, is the story of the murder of Charlie Howard. The death that was the inspiration of the murder in the opening scene of It Chapter 2 to the character Adrian Mellon. What do you think? I think it's one of the most fucked up things I've ever heard in my life. It breaks my heart. And when I watched the movie, which if you haven't seen it, it's fine. The original is so much better. But the original doesn't include the scene that we're talking about. It's in the book, not in the original movie, but it is in the remake. Anyway, when I watched it, it really, really bothered me, that scene, and I found myself really affected, and I found myself tearing up. And it was weird because, I watch a lot of scary movies. Horror movies are kind of my thing. So I'm not one to typically be affected by fiction in that way. It just felt incredibly real, and I found myself having a lot of trouble separating in my mind and seeing this scene as a lighthearted, fun, scary movie. It's just, you know what I mean when you watch a scary movie. But for whatever reason, I could not separate that in my head because of the content. And to be fair, I do have a soft spot for these types of cases. Hate crimes against any group of marginalized people really, really gets under my skin, and I have a hard time compartmentalizing my feelings regarding those types of cases. So anyway, when I watched it, I couldn't get it out of my head. And then to go online and find out that it was real was insane to me. And it made sense why it affected me so much. And because it just felt very real. And then to see that most people don't know about this case was mind-blowing. And I felt like people needed to know. They needed to see what happened, hear what happened to Charlie, and see how these kids essentially got a slap on the wrist for murdering someone. I can't imagine living in that area at that time and having something like that happen so close to home. And I can completely see why Stephen King, a writer, would be affected by that enough to write it in this book, when the book It is a book about actual nightmares. Stephen King said of the murder of Charlie Howard, and I quote, "At the time I started writing It, the Howard murder had just happened. It was fresh in my mind, and it fitted my idea of Derry as a place where terrible things happened, and maybe needless to say, I was outraged. It was a hate crime." In 2014, he also said of the crime, and I quote, "I think the death of Charlie Howard shocked people in the Bangor area out of their complacency about matters of sexual preference and prejudice. I know it did me. It's easy enough to see what happened as a stupid crime, a kind of felonious accident fueled by booze, hazing that got out of hand. Probably too easy. In the aftermath of this inoffensive young man's death, the community underwent a period of self-examination that hasn't ended to this day. To me, that suggests one good thing came out of Charlie Howard's death, but when I look back on it, I'm still overcome with feelings of sadness and shame. I don't feel responsible exactly, and I never lay that on the community, but it's our town. We live here, which means that we have to live with Charlie, and we have to continue trying to make this right. And that line gets to me, that we have to continue trying to make this right, because that line applies to us as a human race, my dudes, just in general. Things like this should not happen, and nobody should ever be targeted or hurt or killed for their sexuality, and that's a hill that I'm willing to die on. And if you disagree, please don't even say anything, because we are so far removed from one another. We are not going to meet in the middle on this. There's not really a compromise in my mind on this. It's not going to be received well if you disagree, like if you're a dick about it. And I'm okay with saying this, that in my humble opinion, if you feel negatively towards a person based on their sexuality and hate someone because of who they love, that's fucking stupid. So that's how I feel. But we're going to be discussing the senseless rape and murder of Brandon Teena. I want to note right off the bat that this story we're going to be talking about a trans man. Brandon Teena was born biologically female, and in a lot of the documentaries and articles and just in doing my research, I see a lot of people refer to Brandon as a she or her or as Teena, but I am going to be referring to Brandon as a he and a him and as Brandon, because that is the way Brandon wanted to identify. That is how Brandon saw himself, and that is who Brandon was and who we're going to be discussing. So in respect to him, I'm going to be referring to him as him. And I'd also like to add that I don't think that I am as versed in all of the terminology as maybe I should be as a human being existing in the world. But just know that if I get anything wrong, it is simply a lack of information and not disrespect, because I have nothing but love for every single person. I mean, unless you suck. You know what I mean? So just know that it's coming all from a place of love and acceptance, and if it's anything comes off incorrect, it's just a lack of information and not me being a dick, because I'd like to think that I'm not a dick. Okay, so now before we get into the story, just in case you don't know about it, though I feel like a lot of people do, but in case you don't, just know we're going to be discussing a really, really horrible hate crime that involves sexual assault, and it's pretty gnarly and it's pretty messed up, so viewer discretion and all of that. So Brandon Teena was a trans male that was born December 12th, 1972, making him a Sagittarius, and he was born in Lincoln, Nebraska. And Brandon was given the birth name of Teena Renee Brandon. Brandon was raised by a single mother named Joanne Brandon alongside his older sister, Tammy Brandon, and his father, unfortunately, was killed in a car accident months before he was even born. So Brandon realized from a very young age that he was different. He rejected traditionally female gender roles and started dressing in male clothing and dating exclusively women as young as adolescence. He started real young. He knew who he was, and he started adopting it right away. Brandon would say later in life, when he was discussing why he dressed the way he did and why he dated women, he would say that he was suffering from a sexual identity crisis. And I honestly think part of the lack of understanding in this case and the lack of acceptance has to do with the time and the place that this is happening, because of course right now in this day and age, being transgender is much better understood and accepted than it was in the 90s in Nebraska, where this story takes place. Though we're still not as good as we could be, but at least we're headed in the right direction. We're a lot better off than we were then. But when Brandon was growing up in the 80s and 90s in Nebraska, it wasn't as understood or accepted. And unfortunately, Brandon's choice to live his life bravely and openly with his preferred pronouns in the way that he wanted to be and identifying in who he felt like he was, it inevitably led to a series of vicious hate crimes that inevitably led to his death. So understandably, Growing up was difficult for Brandon. I mean, with everything else going on and being raised by a single mom, not being able to be who he was and be accepted, he was a little bit challenging. He was known as a troubled child, a problem child, and he was actually expelled from high school his senior year, right before graduation, after he started missing classes and failing his classes in general. Please ignore this. It's not going anywhere. Taking up real estate on my face, paying no rent, freeloading. So after being expelled, Brandon started to essentially support himself financially, take responsibility for himself in that way. But he did this by committing petty crimes and taking odd jobs. But every job he took, he presented himself as a man. So Brandon had many girlfriends growing up, and for his reasons, which I know some people will probably have something to say about this, but Brandon chose not to tell them that he was trans and that he was still, technically speaking, biologically female. And the girls never questioned it based on the way that Brandon presented himself and the way that he looked. Everyone who was interviewed that I saw who had been Brandon's girlfriends or just girls that he casually dated had nothing but good things to say about Brandon. He was described as the perfect boyfriend. He was attentive and caring and just knew exactly how to please a woman. Brandon was actually even engaged to a girl at the time. Her name was Gina, and she was just like this really pretty girl named Gina. And Brandon had her name tattooed on one of his biceps, just a little Gina. And initially, Gina says she didn't know that Brandon was transgender, but a while after dating, I mean, they were serious, she did find out. And initially, she was confused. She would say to Brandon that they were in a gay relationship, and Brandon would get really upset saying that that wasn't the case because he was a man and she was a woman. So it wasn't a gay relationship. But, you know, Gina, she didn't understand how that was true considering he hadn't had the surgery and he was still physically female. So it was a complicated situation, especially with a lack of information. Because of the time that this was happening, but the couple stayed together anyway for a while. But unfortunately, the relationship didn't end up lasting because Brandon, as I said before, committed petty crimes, and one of these things that Brandon did was he stole money, he forged checks, and he purchased Gina an engagement ring, but when Gina looked into the engagement ring, she found that he had actually taken her debit card or credit card to buy the ring. So he initially used her money to buy her own ring. So she's like, I bought my own ring. And the two argued about this and he denied it. And she's like, bro, I know you did. And finally he admitted it, but rightfully upset, Gina did end the engagement. So after growing up in his hometown and having everyone there, because it was a small area, know his backstory, not being able to openly be himself without somebody, you know, being like, well, that's, you know, not the case because I know the case. In addition, he had several convictions for check fraud, which landed Brandon on probation. He decided that he wanted to get away from all of it and start anew. He needed a change. He wanted to go somewhere where nobody knew his name. So, at 20 years old, in November of 1993, Brandon decided to head out on his own. So he left his home in Lincoln, Nebraska to hopefully start a new life in a new place and have a better existence being himself. New beginnings, all that. So, Brandon headed to the Falls City area of Nebraska, where he moved in with a single mother by the name of Lisa Lambert. Lisa had a young toddler son named Tanner, and it was unclear to me in doing my research if Brandon knew Lisa ahead of time and they arranged for him to move in with her, or if he just kind of went there and drifted a bit and then met her and was able to charm her and easily be able to move in because all of this happened so quickly. But either way, he moved in with Lisa. And it's also unclear if these two had a romantic relationship. There are rumors that they did, but that doesn't mean that it is true. All we know for sure is that Brandon moved in and stayed with Lisa. And while living with Lisa, Brandon met and started quickly dating a 18-year-old girl by the name of Lana Tisdale. When they met, it was early in the month of December of 1993, and the relationship was quick, and the two were instantly inseparable. as is common when you get into a relationship, when Brandon and Lana started dating, Brandon got close with Lana's friends. You know, all the people she kept in her close circle, he hung out with and he became friends with as well. As, you know, as happens. Among the friends that Brandon became close with, that Lana was friends with, were two men who were both heavy drinkers with criminal records, one being named John Lauder and the other being named Marvin, or Tom as he went by Neeson. But we're just going to call him Tom because that's how he's referred to always. Unfortunately, not much is known about the friendship between Brandon and these two men, and that's likely because everything in this case happened so quickly. Brandon left home in November, started dating Lana in early December of 1993, and would unfortunately, tragically, and ridiculously have his life ended before the end of December. It was December 31st. So all of this happened in less than a month. I'm gonna quickly throw on some brows, so 1 second. So it seemed that, unfortunately, moving to a new area and trying to start anew did not mitigate Brandon's habit of forging checks, and he was again arrested for check fraud while in the Falls City area. And unfortunately, this is when Brandon's birth name of Teena Brandon and his biological sex became known to the people in his life in Falls City. Lana had gone to the jail to bail Brandon out, where he had been being held in the female section of the jail, and that is when she found out. She did still bail him out though on December 22nd, and in Brandon being arrested, his information was also put into the local newspaper where the rest of the people in the area were able to read Brandon's true name and true sex, as they put it, which, you know, but that's what happened. So quickly, the friends that Brandon had made in Falls City, they started to find out the secrets that Brandon had kept from them, and they started to get upset. It's honestly so sad, and I feel so bad for Brandon to have to go through this, because not only, I don't know, it just makes me feel bad. Lana, the girl he was dating, her mother confronted Brandon and shoved him into a dresser and demanded to know the truth from him. Michelle Lauder, who was John Lauder's sister and Lana's best friend, so had become Brandon's good friend, was super pissed off and told Lana that Brandon needed to get out of town, that he didn't need to be there anymore, that she wanted him to leave. And she was just pissed, and she said that she wasn't just angry, but that she was also worried as to what would happen to Brandon if he chose to stay. Which, apparently, she had some idea of how her brother was, so there's that. Brandon wrote Lana a letter saying that he didn't want to hurt her, but he wanted to leave, which is so sad that he didn't get a chance to. He said that he was sad that he couldn't be accepted and he just wanted to leave. But he didn't leave, and sadly, he should have. I go back and forth because on one hand, he shouldn't have to run away and hide because these small-minded bigots can't deal with the fact that he is who he is, and he shouldn't let them chase him out of town. But I wish that he had, because then he would still be alive today. Well, so John Lauder and Tom Neeson, like all of Brandon's other friends, had learned that Brandon was transgender. And from learning, they became enraged and obsessed with Brandon. They wanted to show Lana that it was true. I don't know if she had been like denying that Brandon was transgender or what, but they wanted to show Lana that it was true and show that Brandon was still biologically female. So they invited Brandon to a party on Christmas Eve. And while at the party, the two men, John Lauder and Tom Neeson, grabbed Brandon and forced him into a bathroom. And while in the bathroom, they started to rip off Brandon's clothes. One of the men stood behind Brandon and held his arms above his head. I believe that was Tom. And the other man pulled Brandon's pants and underwear down to his ankles, exposing his private body to Lana and to other party guests. Now, this part I don't understand, and I don't think I ever will, but Brandon didn't leave, and I'm not sure why, but he stayed at that house after this assault that night, and in the early morning hours following the party, Tom and John went up to Brandon and said that they needed to talk to him, where they then took him into the bathroom again and started to beat him. One held the door, I believe, again, that was Tom, where John then proceeded to punch Brandon twice in the head and kick him in the ribs while he was down. He then picked Brandon up off the ground by his jacket that he was wearing and dragged him out to the car outside. The two men then forced Brandon into the back seat of their car and kidnapped Brandon, driving out to a remote area of Humboldt County. While there, Tom told Brandon that he could either make the situation hard on himself and get the shit beat out of him, or he could make it easy on himself, but either way, he was going to be raped. The two men then took turns raping Brandon in the backseat of their car. Brandon was a virgin. After returning back to the house that the party had taken place at, Brandon was able to escape by sneaking out of a window, and he fled to Lana's house where he told her what happened. Initially, Brandon was resistant to the idea of reporting the assault because the men, had told him that if he had, they would kill him. But after telling Lana and Lana's mother, I believe, they convinced him that he should report the assault. So Brandon did report what happened, and a rape kit was taken. Brandon was questioned about the assault. Well, it was supposed to be Brandon being questioned, but it turned into more Brandon being interrogated by an officer named Charles Laux, I believe is how you pronounce it. It's Laux. And the way this officer questioned Brandon was honestly disgusting. If you've never read the transcripts or heard the interview, I would like to say you should, but it's also incredibly upsetting to hear. The questions he asked were just so inappropriate. For example, he asked, so when the men, I keep saying boys, these were men. So when the men had you in the bathroom and took off your pants and realized you were a girl, did they fondle you any? And Brandon said no. And he said, oh, that's strange, don't you think? Don't you think that if they had seen that you were a woman, they would have stuck some fingers in you? It was something along those lines, and it's so gross. It's so gross. And then this is a part that I wanted to read to you from the interview also. I wrote this part down, so give me a second. So, when he is interviewing Brandon about him being raped by these men, he asked Brandon, why do you go around kissing girls being as that you're a girl yourself? And Brandon says, I haven't the slightest idea. I have a sexual identity crisis. Laux. The girls that don't know about you think you're a guy. You go around kissing them? And Brandon rightfully says, what does this have to do with what happened last night? Where Laux says, I'm trying to get some answers so I know exactly what's going on. Yeah, Laux, what exactly does that line of questioning have to do with Brandon being raped? Dick. So even though Brandon reported his assault and the rape kit did show that there was a sign of rape, John Lauder and Tom Neeson were not arrested. Instead, they were simply called in for questioning on December 28th, but then they were allowed to leave due to a lack of evidence, giving these men enough time to put together and execute their planned murder. So, after Brandon reported the assault, Lana's mother, you remember Lana's mother, the one who confronted Brandon and pushed him into a dresser just because she was a concerned mother. That's what she said in her interview. Anyway, she went over to visit John Lauder and Tom Neeson, and she confronted them and asked them if they had done what Brandon said they had done, because she didn't believe Brandon, and the two said no. Where she proceeded to say, well, Brandon's reported it, so if you did do anything, you might want to clean up any evidence. She admitted to saying this. And at that point, that is when Tom went to the kitchen and got a pan of soapy water and a rag and started to clean up. And this is when she believed Brandon. This lady is an asshole. I'm sorry. That is such a... Who does that? I don't know. But, like, this lady's an asshole, and I maintain that this lady's an asshole. So angry that Brandon had gone to the police, angry that Brandon had duped them in the first place, and worried that Brandon would press charges and get them arrested. On December 31st in the early morning hours, I believe it was around like 1 a.m., John Lauder and Tom Neeson got in their car and headed over to where Brandon was staying. This was back at Lisa Lambert's home, which was about 30 miles away from where the men were. And what I read online, but I wasn't able to confirm if it was true, it's just something that was floating around in a few articles, was that the men had actually been looking for Brandon for a couple of days and weren't sure where he was. So they had gone to Lana to ask Lana where he was, and Lana's mother had told them that Brandon was at Lisa's. I don't know if that's accurate, but that is what is being said. And given what she's admitted to, it's not that out of the realm of possibilities for me to believe that she would do that. But they head over to the isolated home where Lisa Lambert, Lisa's toddler son, Tanner, Brandon, and a friend of Lisa's family, Philip Devine, were all staying. Lisa, who is 23, and Philip, who is 22, were both shot twice. I couldn't tell online where exactly in the body Philip had been shot. I did look at the crime scene photos and it looked to be in his abdomen. Lisa, I know, was shot once in the stomach and once through her eye. And Brandon was shot once, I believe, and it was right under the chin is where the bullet entered. Tom Neeson, admits that after shooting Brandon, or after Brandon was shot, he grabbed a knife and stabbed Brandon in the stomach to ensure that he was dead. Brandon was murdered on December 31st, 1993, just a little over a week after his 21st birthday. So on December 31st, Lisa's mother, worried because Lisa hadn't shown up at work, went over to the house to check on her daughter and her grandson. Upon arrival, she started knocking on the door but received no answer, but she could hear her grandson Tanner crying from within. And when Lisa did not console Tanner and and Tanner continued to cry, Lisa's mother became worried and at that point entered the apartment, where she found the bodies and retrieved the baby, who had been left in that house with those dead bodies all night. So the police at least had evidence tying Tom to the crime scene, but the evidence they had on John Lauder was weak, and since the police wanted to ensure that they could get a conviction of both men, they actually made a deal with Tom Neeson, which he did accept, and in this deal, the death penalty was taken off the table for Tom, and in exchange, he would testify against John Lauder. Due to Tom Neeson's testimony, John Lauder was given the death penalty when he was tried in 1996, and this was following Tom Neeson's trial, which happened first in 1995, where he was given 3 life sentences for the murders. In 2007, Tom Neeson recanted his testimony that he had given at John Lauder's trial. He said that he felt bad knowing that a man was on death row due to his lies, and admitted that it wasn't John Lauder who had been the trigger man at the murders, that Tom himself had actually been the one who shot all the bullets that killed Brandon, Lisa, and Philip. He said that John Lauder was just his accomplice. And due to this, John Lauder was trying to get a new trial due to this new information. But even if he got a new trial, he likely wouldn't be released from prison or anything like that, because due to the state law in Nebraska, if you are complicit in a crime, you can then be convicted of that crime. So since he was complicit to the murder of these 3 people, he could still be considered guilty of murdering them himself. So he wouldn't get out, but if he got a new trial, he could possibly get off death row. And even in Tom Neeson's recanted new confession, he still says that John Lauder was there to help him. They planned the murders together, and that John Lauder was actually at the crime scene. So he still was heavily involved. He just may not have been the one who actually pulled the trigger, which I don't know. I think I kind of actually believe that, because in all the interviews I saw, everybody who knew them, Tom seemed to be more of the instigating type, the more of the leader. John seemed to be more of a follower, and he said to have a pretty low IQ, and so that he may not have been capable of planning something like this, but would easily go along, if you know what I mean. But as of 2018, John Lauder's most recent appeal was rejected, so he has not got his new trial. Brandon's mother, Joanne, did file a civil suit against the Richardson County and actually Sheriff Locks himself, individually. Richardson County was found negligent in not arresting the two men and not providing Brandon with protective custody and making sure that Brandon was safe after reporting his assault. But they did find that Charles Locks was not guilty of intentionally inflicting emotional distress. The last I read, Joanne was awarded around $17,000 for the wrongful death suit. Brandon's murder did initially make headlines as one of the most heinous hate crimes in America at the time, but it became popularized nationwide when Brandon's story was made into a movie, which you may have seen. It's called Boys Don't Cry, and it starred Hilary Swank, and that's actually where I first learned about this case at all. There's also a book called All She Wanted. I haven't read that. My mom owns it. I haven't got a chance to read it, but another resource that you could look to if you want to learn more about the case. It frustrates me that the sheriff wasn't found to be more accountable, to be honest. It seemed to me that he was looking more for a way to excuse Brandon's rapist than to help Brandon himself, you know? That's just how it felt. It felt like he was more interested in like what the reasoning was that these men would want to rape Brandon than to actually help somebody who had just been raped. I can't imagine being raped and then having an officer ask me the questions that Brandon was asked. It's like being violated all over again, but by the person who's supposed to be there to protect and serve you. If he had listened to Brandon and arrested John Lauder and Tom Neeson, Brandon would still be alive today. And I hope that that weighs on him, because it should. It was preventable and it was avoidable, and he is responsible, at least partially. He didn't do it, but he allowed it to happen by being inactive and insensitive, because this beautiful boy just wanted to live his life and have his existence acknowledged and affirmed and respected. But his life was cut short at only 21 years old, and in such a brutal way. The last week of Brandon's life, he was outed, he was ridiculed, he was beaten, he was raped, and then he was abused by the exact people that we expect to protect and to serve us. It almost seems like maybe the police shouldn't be the ones who are dealing with rape victims. I don't know, just a thought. But that is the terribly sad story of the rape and murder of Brandon Teena. If you're interested in this case and you haven't seen the documentary, it's called The Brandon Teena Story, I believe. I would suggest it. I watched it on Tubi. It's one of the many free streaming platforms that I found during quarantine. This isn't like sponsored or anything. I'm just letting you know, because in staying home, I needed to find new ways to watch things, and Tubi is just one of those ones. Like if you have a smart TV or a Fire Stick or anything, you can download the app, and there's a lot of free stuff on there that's not on like Netflix or Hulu. So that's where I watched the documentary, and I know it's still there because I just watched it. And if you want to watch the movie Boys Don't Cry, I know you can rent it on Amazon for like $3. I don't know if you need Amazon Prime for that, but either way, those are the two ways that I know that you could access the resources that I think would be valuable for you to watch, because me telling a story, I'm giving you as much information as I can, as much as I feel is relevant, but there's something very different about hearing. You can hear the interview between Brandon and the officer yourself. You can hear interviews directly from his rapist and murderer's mouths themselves and the people who actually knew Brandon, and of course that is valuable in itself. So anyways, guys, that completes this video. I hope it was informative and made sense, and of course I hope that you enjoyed it. Of course, make sure to let me know of any cases you'd like to see me cover down below. I have an ongoing list, but I'd love to hear your ideas because I know you're full of good ideas. I know it. I know it. Of course, make sure to join the Brat Pack and hang out with us by subscribing and ringing the bell. I put out new videos every week and I would love to hang out with you. And with that said, thank you for being here when you could literally be anywhere else on the internet. You're tight, this is tight, and I hope to see you in my next video.